Beneath the surface of our carefully written history lies a realm of unanswered questions, events, artifacts, and entire civilizations that defy reason. They whisper from the shadows of time, challenging the stories we've been told. A stone structure older than recorded memory. A coded message carved into the earth that no one alive can read. A disappearance that still echoes across centuries. These mysteries are not just puzzles. They are reminders that the past is not fixed, but alive, shifting, and incomplete. From the windswept deserts of Palestine to the icy reaches of the Arctic, clues lie buried, waiting for the right eyes to see them. Why do certain truths remain hidden? What forces, natural or human, erase entire chapters from our collective memory? Tonight, we journey beyond textbooks and into the unknown. You'll witness the strange, the beautiful, and the unsettling remnants of worlds we barely understand. So sit back, steady your mind, and prepare yourself, because what you're about to discover may change the way you see history forever. The Flannan Isles rise abruptly from the restless waters of the North Atlantic, a small, wind-lashed cluster of rocky outcrops some 20 miles west of Scotland's Outer Hebrides. For most of human history, these islands have been uninhabited, their treeless slopes home only to seabirds, wild grass, and the roar of the sea. In winter, the weather here can turn without warning, clouds racing low over the water, waves hammering the cliffs with relentless force. It is a place that feels untouched, remote, on the very edge of the world. At the turn of the 20th century, this isolation made the Flannans an ideal, if harsh, site for a lighthouse. Built in 1899 on the largest island, Elian Moor, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse was intended to guide ships safely through these treacherous waters. Manned by 3 keepers at a time, it stood as a solitary human presence against the wild Atlantic, its light sweeping across the darkness each night. But in December of 1900, just over a year after it began operating, the lighthouse became the center of one of the most enduring maritime mysteries in British history. It began innocuously enough. On December 15th, the steamer Arctur passed the islands on its way to Leith. The captain noted that the light was not shining, an unusual and troubling sign, especially in the depths of winter. The report reached the Northern Lighthouse Board, but weather delayed any immediate response. It wasn't until December 26th that the relief vessel Hesperus was able to make the crossing, carrying supplies, a replacement keeper, and the lighthouse's principal keeper, Joseph Moore, who had been ashore during the preceding weeks. What Moore found upon arrival was unsettling. The lighthouse's doors were locked. Inside, everything was in place. Beds neatly made, the clock stopped, the lamp ready for lighting. In the kitchen, there was a meal that seemed never to have been eaten. But the 3 men, Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur, were nowhere to be found. Outside, things were stranger still. At the West Landing, Moore discovered signs of storm damage. Bent railings, a broken supply box, ropes scattered down the cliffside. The logbook entries, recovered later, painted an odd picture. On December 12th, Marshall noted a severe gale and waves higher than he had ever seen in 20 years at sea. He described the men's growing anxiety, even mentioning that Ducat had been very quiet, and that MacArthur, known for his toughness, had been reduced to tears. On December 13th, the entries spoke of continued storms and rising seas, despite the fact that meteorological records indicated relatively calm weather in the area at that time. The last entry was dated December 15th, the day the Arctur passed without seeing the light. It simply read, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." The official investigation concluded that the men had likely been swept away by a sudden, massive wave while securing equipment during a storm. The damage to the West Landing supported this theory, as did the dangerous nature of the work. But there were details that didn't quite fit. Why had 2 of the men been wearing heavy oilskins, while the third's weather gear remained inside? If all 3 had gone out together, would one have really left without proper protection? And if the storm had ended by the final log entry, what catastrophe could have struck them in calm seas? Over the years, these unanswered questions gave rise to speculation. Some suggested that one keeper might have fallen into the sea, prompting the others to rush to his aid, only to be dragged under themselves. Others floated the idea of a rogue wave, an enormous wall of water known to appear suddenly in open ocean, powerful enough to strip rock from a cliff face. But other theories ventured beyond the realm of the strictly plausible. A few proposed that the men had been caught up in a criminal act. Perhaps a passing ship had landed on the island for illicit purposes, leading to violence and disappearance. More imaginative minds have suggested abduction by foreign agents, by some unknown seafaring group, or even by forces not of this world. A handful of stories weave in older island legends, tales of spirits haunting the Flannans, of ancient Celtic ruins said to be cursed, of a great bird that could carry a man away. There were even whispers about the psychological toll of isolation. Life as a lighthouse keeper was grueling, with weeks spent in close quarters, the endless roar of the sea outside, and the constant vigilance required to keep the light burning. Could one man have succumbed to madness and taken the others with him? No hard evidence ever supported such a claim, but it remained in the public imagination, part of the tapestry of conjecture. In the decades since, the case has resisted closure. Modern re-examinations of the evidence often lean toward a combination of bad luck and the island's treacherous conditions. It's possible that the men, in performing their duties, found themselves in exactly the wrong place at the wrong moment, victims of the sea they had been entrusted to guard against. Yet even this pragmatic explanation leaves an aftertaste of uncertainty. The timing, the odd logbook entries, the absence of certain expected signs, it all leaves the impression that something remains just out of reach. Today, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse is automated. No human presence remains on Elian Moor, save for occasional maintenance crews and the ever-present seabirds. The keeper's disappearance has become part of local lore, told in maritime histories and whispered in pubs along the Hebrides. Standing there now, looking out over the gray Atlantic as the wind sweeps hard across the rock, it is easy to feel the weight of the past pressing in. What truly happened to those 3 men in December 1900? Was it simply the sea, indifferent, unpredictable, and merciless, that claimed them? Or was there something else, something beyond the reach of our records and reason, that unfolded in those final days? More than a century later, the answer remains as elusive as the men themselves, leaving only the silent light and the restless waves to bear witness. Tucked away in the quiet Bavarian countryside, about 70 kilometers north of Munich, there once stood a lonely farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck. Surrounded by fields and dense woodland, it was a place where the wind carried the scent of tilled earth, and the silence after dusk was broken only by the lowing of cattle or the creak of wooden beams in the farmhouse. In 1922, this remote homestead was home to Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabrielle, Victoria's 2 young children, and the family's maid. It was an unremarkable farm by appearance: weathered walls, a pitched roof under which hay was stored, and outbuildings that seemed to have been there for decades. But in late March of that year, something began to unsettle those who knew the family. A few days before tragedy struck, Andreas mentioned to neighbors that he had discovered strange footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the house, but none returning. Doors and windows had been found unlocked, and at night he heard footsteps in the attic. Footsteps he could not explain. A set of house keys had gone missing. Even the maid, fearful of what she described as a haunted atmosphere, had left months earlier, only for a replacement to arrive just the day before everything changed. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, the farm became the scene of one of Germany's most haunting unsolved crimes. Over the next few days, neighbors noticed the family's absence. Mail went uncollected, and no one was seen tending the animals. When visitors finally entered the property on April 4th, they were met with a sight that would linger in memory and rumor for decades. In the barn, beneath a thin layer of straw, lay the bodies of Andreas, Kazilia, Victoria, and the 7-year-old Kazilia. All bore the marks of brutal blows to the head, delivered by a mattock or similar farm tool. Inside the house, in her bed, the family's maid was found dead. In the cradle nearby, the youngest member of the household, 2-year-old Joseph, had been killed as well. The arrangement of the crime scene was as perplexing as it was horrifying. Investigators determined that the victims in the barn had been killed one by one, each lured or forced into the darkness. Even stranger, evidence suggested that after the murders, the killer, or killers, remained on the property for several days. The livestock had been fed, meals had been prepared, and the fireplace had been used. The crime stunned the rural community, and the investigation that followed was exhaustive for its time. Police interviewed over 100 people, including neighbors, traveling laborers, and soldiers returning from the First World War. They examined motives ranging from robbery to deeply personal grievances. Money and valuables remained untouched, casting doubt on the theory of a simple burglary gone wrong. Suspicion naturally fell on those who had been close to the family. Some pointed to an ongoing dispute between Andreas and Victoria's late husband's relatives. Others noted that Andreas was rumored to have had an inappropriate relationship with his daughter, a rumor that, if true, might have bred resentment or scandal. Victoria herself had been known to seek the help of a local priest in pressing for her husband's release from a prisoner of war camp, suggesting complicated dynamics within the household. And yet, no one could produce definitive evidence. Theories multiplied in the absence of answers. One posited that a disgruntled farmhand or transient worker might have harbored a grudge. Another speculated that Victoria's rumored romantic involvement with a neighbor had ended badly. And then there were the stranger explanations. Some locals whispered that the footprints Andreas found were not the work of any man from the village, but of something, or someone, living deep in the forest. Others claimed to have seen lights moving between the trees on the night of the murders. Over time, these stories grew into folklore, giving the crime an eerie, almost supernatural dimension. One particularly unsettling detail lingered in police records. The braided hair of young Cecilia appeared to have been torn out, as though she had struggled violently before death. And yet, the rest of the household animals, from the cows to the farm dogs, remained unharmed, suggesting the killer's deliberate restraint, even amid an act of slaughter. The investigation stretched on for years, but each promising lead collapsed under scrutiny. Forensic methods at the time could not provide the kind of clarity modern science might offer. Even exhumations decades later failed to shed light on the case. By the 1950s, the original farmhouse was demolished, its stones carted away, leaving only a memorial at the site where 6 lives were taken. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain officially unsolved. Today, historians and amateur sleuths sift through the surviving police files, comparing notes, analyzing photographs, and revisiting old witness statements. Some hold fast to the idea of a lone killer, a figure driven by a dark obsession or deep resentment, who took advantage of the farm's isolation. Others wonder whether more than one person could have been involved, acting in concert and sharing a silence that lasted the rest of their lives. But the deeper question remains: why linger? Why, After committing such a brutal act, would the perpetrator stay in the house, tending animals, eating the family's food, sleeping under their roof? Was it a calculated effort to disguise the crime and delay discovery? Or was it something more disturbing, a need to inhabit the victim's world for a time, as though unwilling to let go? On quiet nights, when the wind sweeps over the empty fields where Hinterkaifeck once stood, it is not hard to imagine the sound of boots crunching in snow, the faint echo of an attic floorboard creaking under unseen weight. The murders sit at the uneasy intersection of fact and speculation, where human violence meets the enduring unknown. And so, more than a century later, the question lingers in the cold Bavarian air. Was the answer to this grim puzzle buried with its victims? Or does someone, somewhere, still know the truth? In the remote heart of Siberia, where the taiga stretches unbroken for hundreds of miles, there lies a land of endless pine and larch, marsh and river. In summer, the air is thick with mosquitoes. In winter, the snow muffles all sound. It is a place few outsiders had ever seen in 1908, a place where the horizon feels infinite and the wilderness swallows anything that enters it. It was here, near the Podkamanaya Tunguska River, that the stillness was shattered on the morning of June 30th. At approximately 7:17 a.m., a fireball blazed across the clear sky. Witnesses, some living more than 40 miles away, described it as brighter than the sun, trailing a column of light and heat. Moments later, the ground convulsed. A shockwave tore through the forest, flattening trees in all directions, and a deafening roar echoed for minutes. The blast was so powerful that it registered on seismic stations as far away as Great Britain, and atmospheric disturbances were reported across Europe and Asia. In the days that followed, skies thousands of miles from Siberia glowed with a strange pearlescent light, so bright that people in London and St. Petersburg could read newspapers outdoors at midnight. Yet, when the first scientific expedition reached the site, nearly 2 decades later, they found no crater. Instead, the devastation spread in a vast radial pattern. Some 80 million trees lay splintered and burned across more than 2,000 square kilometers, their trunks pointing away from a central point like the spokes of a wheel. At the very center, the forest showed signs of intense scorching but no impact depression, as if the destructive force had come from above, not below. The most widely accepted explanation even today is that a small asteroid or comet, perhaps 50 to 60 meters in diameter, entered Earth's atmosphere and exploded at an altitude of 5 to 10 kilometers, releasing the energy equivalent of 10 to 15 megatons of TNT. This airburst would have been powerful enough to flatten the forest while leaving no crater. The absence of large fragments might be explained by the body's composition: a fragile, icy comet nucleus, or a stony asteroid that disintegrated completely in the atmosphere. But questions remain. Why have no definitive fragments ever been recovered? Could the lack of an impact crater be the result of some other phenomenon? And what of the eyewitness accounts describing not one, but multiple explosions or the strange behavior of animals in the days before the blast? Local Evenki people told of reindeer fleeing the area, of strange winds and sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. Some theories venture further afield. In the decades since, ideas have ranged from the plausible to the speculative. A few researchers have suggested that Tunguska was the result of a rare meteorite composed of antimatter, its contact with the atmosphere annihilating both matter and antimatter in a burst of pure energy. Others have wondered if it could have been a natural gas explosion, triggered by a sudden release of methane from beneath the Earth's surface, perhaps ignited by lightning or another atmospheric event. And then there are the more fringe propositions. The notion of a comet carrying alien microbes, dispersing biological material across the Earth, or that the explosion was the unintended result of some form of advanced technology, perhaps a test or a malfunction from a distant civilization, ours or another. Intriguingly, in the years following the event, no conclusive human casualties were recorded, though there were reports of nomadic Evenki herders being injured or killed by the shockwave. The remoteness of the area may have spared large-scale loss of life, but it also meant that precious evidence was lost to time before investigators could arrive. When Leonid Kulik's 1927 expedition finally reached Tunguska, the forest had already begun to reclaim the scar. Kulik's photographs show matchstick trees laid flat in perfect radial symmetry, nature's own record of the blast. Yet, despite his efforts, Kulik found no impactor. He returned multiple times, seeking meteorite fragments, but left each time empty-handed. The mystery endured. In modern times, satellite imagery and improved field studies have reinforced the airburst hypothesis, but without physical remnants of the object, it remains unconfirmed. Drilling projects in the area have occasionally uncovered microscopic glassy spheres, possibly the fused remnants of meteoritic material, but none have provided the definitive proof needed to close the case. Even now, over a century later, the Tunguska Event remains the largest recorded explosion in human history, not caused by human hands. It is a reminder that our planet moves through a cosmic shooting gallery, and that on rare occasions, something from the heavens can reach down and change the landscape in moments. But it is also a reminder of how much we still do not know about the nature of such events, about the forces that shape our world, and about what might yet come from the sky. Standing in the Tunguska region today, the forest has fully returned, hiding the devastation beneath new growth. The air is heavy with the scent of pine, and the river runs quietly through the land, giving no hint of the violence that once tore through it. And yet, for those who know the history, the silence holds a question. Did we truly understand what happened here in 1908? Or does the taiga still guard a secret, one we have yet to uncover? On a warm Whitsun evening in May 1828, the streets of Nuremberg bustled with the life of a growing Bavarian city. Merchants closed their shops, children darted between carts, and the scent of bread drifted from nearby ovens. Amid this ordinary scene, an extraordinary figure appeared. A young man, perhaps 16 or 17, dressed in coarse, ill-fitting clothes, walking with an awkward, stumbling gait. He carried a sealed letter addressed to a local cavalry captain, and when approached, he spoke haltingly, as if unused to conversation. The letter claimed he had been kept in total isolation for as long as he could remember, confined to a small dark cell, without human contact except for a faceless caretaker who brought him bread and water. He could barely write his name, Kaspar Hauser, and could say little else, repeating only phrases about wanting to be a cavalryman like his father. He seemed bewildered by the world around him, startled by the noise of the streets, unfamiliar with the simplest tools or customs. In the days that followed, the citizens of Nuremberg flocked to see him. Physicians examined him and noted his pale complexion, soft hands, and strange gait, signs, they thought, of someone who had spent his life without sunlight or exercise. His eyes were sensitive to light, his taste for food limited to bread and milk. The story he told, fragmented and childlike, captured the imagination of the public. Speculation about his origins spread quickly. Was he the abandoned child of a noble family, hidden away to remove him from a line of succession? Some whispered he was connected to the House of Baden, the victim of a plot to place another heir on the throne. Others thought he might be a fraud, an opportunist weaving a tale to win sympathy. Over time, Kaspar began to adapt. He learned to read and write, revealing an intelligence and curiosity that astonished his tutors. But his life was never free from intrigue. In October 1829, he was found in the cellar of his caretaker's home, bleeding from a wound to his forehead. He claimed a masked man had attacked him, warning him never to try to discover his true identity. The attacker was never found. Later, in 1830, while living with another guardian, Kaspar suffered a knife wound to his head. Again, he spoke of a mysterious assailant. Again, doubts crept in. Some suspected he had harmed himself to keep public interest alive, while others believed the threats against him were very real. In December 1833, while under the care of a schoolmaster in Ansbach, Kaspar returned home clutching a deep stab wound to his chest. He claimed a stranger had lured him to the palace gardens with the promise of revealing his parentage, only to stab him and flee. Days later, Kaspar died from the injury. In his pocket was a folded note, written in mirror script, containing cryptic references to his birthplace and age. The handwriting, investigators noted, bore similarities to Kaspar's own. Theories about Kaspar's identity multiplied after his death. Supporters of the royal conspiracy theory insisted he was the rightful prince of Baden, hidden away as a child to make way for another heir. Skeptics countered that he had fabricated his life story, perhaps suffering from psychological disturbances or driven by a desire for attention. Modern investigations, including DNA testing of artifacts linked to Kaspar, have produced mixed results, some suggesting no link to Baden, others too inconclusive to settle the matter. The inconsistencies in his own accounts, the suspicious nature of his injuries, and the absence of definitive records leave historians divided. And yet, certain aspects defy easy dismissal. How did a boy supposedly raised in isolation learn to read and write so quickly? Could his limited early vocabulary and sensitivity to light be explained by anything other than confinement? If he was a fraud, how did he sustain the deception under such intense public scrutiny? If he was genuine, why did attempts on his life, real or staged, seem to shadow him at every turn? Even now, nearly 2 centuries later, Kaspar Hauser's story hovers between history and legend. His short life was a collision of innocence and intrigue, of a young man pulled into a web of politics, fascination, and suspicion. Standing in the old streets of Nuremberg, where he first appeared, one can almost imagine the confusion in his eyes as he stepped into a world he did not understand, yet one that seemed determined to define him. Was he truly the lost heir to a throne, the victim of a conspiracy that began before he could speak? Or was he the architect of his own myth, creating a persona so strange that it could never be forgotten? The truth remains elusive, perhaps locked away in the shadows of history, waiting for the one piece of evidence that could finally tell us who Kaspar Hauser really was. On the rugged hills of the Gallipoli Peninsula, where the dry grass whispers in the wind and the ground is scarred by the remnants of trenches, the past feels unnervingly close. The land here rolls down toward the Aegean Sea, its slopes once echoing with the thunder of artillery and the cries of advancing soldiers. In 1915, during the First World War, these ridges and valleys were the stage for one of the most grueling campaigns in military history. And it was here, amid the dust and gunpowder, that an entire unit seemed to vanish from the pages of time. The story centers on the 1/5th Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment, part of the British 163rd Brigade. Composed largely of men from rural estates, many employed by King George V himself, the battalion had earned the affectionate nickname the Sandringhams. They arrived at Gallipoli in August, tasked with pushing inland during the Suvla Bay offensive, an operation meant to break the deadlock against Ottoman forces. The conditions were brutal: searing heat by day, bitter cold at night, flies swarming over the wounded, and water in dangerously short supply. On the morning of August 12th, the Sandringhams were ordered to advance across open ground toward high ground near Anafarta. Accounts agree that they moved with determination, though their orders drove them into difficult terrain, dry scrubland cut with gullies under constant enemy fire. Somewhere in this advance, something happened. Witnesses from other units later recalled seeing the battalion moving forward into a low bank of mist or cloud. They entered it in formation, but according to these accounts, they did not emerge on the other side. Official reports at the time were less mysterious, stating that the unit became separated from the main force, pushed too far ahead without adequate support, and was cut down by enemy machine guns. The battlefield, after all, was chaotic and unforgiving. Units were often scattered and communications unreliable. Still, when the fighting ended, no survivors were recovered from the Sandringham's ranks. Even more unsettling, their bodies were not found either, not in the immediate aftermath, nor in the weeks that followed. The mystery deepened in the years after the war. In 1918, when the Gallipoli battlefields were surveyed and war graves registered, search parties did locate remains believed to belong to the missing battalion. Yet the discovery raised more questions than it answered. Some of the bodies were found far from the reported location of their last advance, lying in positions that suggested they had not been hastily buried in battle, but left exposed for some time. Their placement led a few investigators to quietly wonder whether they had been captured and executed, though no definitive evidence surfaced. Decades later, a new dimension was added to the legend. In 1965, a group of New Zealand veterans, who had served in the Gallipoli campaign, came forward with an unusual claim. They testified that on the day in question, they had seen several loaf-shaped clouds, unmoving despite a prevailing breeze, hovering over the battlefield. The 1/5th Battalion, they said, marched directly into one of these clouds, disappearing from sight. The cloud then lifted into the air and drifted away, leaving no trace of the men inside. This testimony, while vivid, is not without problems. Memories of wartime events can blur with time, and extraordinary accounts are often influenced by rumor or folklore. Yet the image of a battalion swallowed by a cloud captured public imagination. Some saw it as a poetic metaphor for the chaos of war. Others treated it as a genuine anomaly, perhaps linked to unusual weather phenomena. Mainstream explanations remain grounded in the realities of the battlefield. The cloud could have been dust or smoke from shellfire, thick enough to obscure vision. In the confusion, the battalion may have been flanked or encircled by Ottoman forces, their final moments lost in the din of combat. The absence of bodies could be explained by the shifting control of the battlefield. Ottoman troops may have buried them in unmarked graves, or the dead may have been scattered over a wider area than initial searches covered. Still, alternative theories persist. Some fringe interpretations lean toward the fantastical, that the battalion was the victim of an unexplainable disappearance, whether through an as-yet unknown natural phenomenon or something beyond our understanding. In the post-war decades, these ideas merged with broader speculation about strange vanishings in history, lending the Sandringhams a place in the realm of enduring mysteries. What complicates matters further is the aura of secrecy surrounding certain wartime records. Some researchers have suggested that the British military may have been reluctant to publicize details of the battalion's fate, especially if it involved a disastrous tactical error or the massacre of captured troops. In this interpretation, the mystery is less supernatural than political, a silence maintained to preserve morale and reputation. Yet the legend endures not because of any single theory, but because of the gap between the official record and the human details. The Sandringhams were not faceless soldiers. They were gardeners, grooms, and laborers from royal estates, men with families who expected them to come home. Their abrupt disappearance left not just a tactical mystery, but a wound in the communities they left behind. Standing today on the Gallipoli ridges, the air carries the scent of wild thyme, and the landscape is deceptively peaceful. The gullies where the Sandringhams advanced are overgrown, their contours softened by time. It takes effort to imagine the noise, the confusion, the haze through which they marched, and whatever it was they encountered in those final moments. Was the cloud nothing more than smoke and dust, masking their destruction in battle? Were they victims of a tragic blunder, their fate quietly buried along with their bodies? Or, as the New Zealand veterans insisted, did they walk into something far stranger, an event without precedent or explanation? Over a century later, the earth of Gallipoli still keeps its secrets. And somewhere, in the distance between history and legend, the lost battalion continues its silent march, disappearing into the mist. In the chill of early December 1872, the Atlantic Ocean stretched endless and gray beneath a restless winter sky. Waves rolled in a steady rhythm, their white crests curling like ghostly fingers. Out here, far from any shore, the two-masted brigantine Mary Celeste cut a lonely figure on the horizon. Her sails billowed gently in the wind, her hull rode high in the water, yet something about her seemed wrong. On December 5th, the Dei Gratia, a Canadian brigantine, spotted her drifting some 400 miles east of the Azores. The crew approached cautiously, calling out across the water. No answer came. From a distance, the Mary Celeste appeared seaworthy, her rigging intact, her course steady. But when the boarding party clambered over her rails, they found a ship abandoned in eerie silence. Below deck, the cabin was orderly. Clothing hung neatly in lockers, the ship's log lay in its place, entries stopping abruptly on November 25th. There was no sign of violence, no overturned furniture, no splintered doors. The cargo hold was full, barrels of industrial alcohol undisturbed except for a few that seemed to have leaked. The lifeboat was gone. The ship's compass and chronometer were missing as well. But there was no reason to think she was sinking. She had food and water for 6 months. Her hull was sound, and her sails, though partially set, could have carried her to safety. The last log entry placed her within sight of the Azores, but whatever happened in those 9 missing days had left no clear trace. Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their young daughter Sophia, and 7 crew members had vanished into the vast Atlantic without a word of explanation. In the immediate aftermath, theories took shape as quickly as the ocean could erase a wake. Some suggested a sudden waterspout or rogue wave might have startled the crew into abandoning ship, fearing the Mary Celeste was foundering. Others speculated that fumes from the alcohol cargo could have escaped from the leaking barrels, creating the smell of impending explosion and prompting a hasty evacuation. Though if so, why had they not returned once the danger passed? Piracy was briefly considered, but discounted. Nothing valuable was missing beyond navigational instruments and the lifeboat. Mutiny, too, was raised as a possibility, yet the lack of any struggle seemed to rule it out. Over the decades, more speculative explanations emerged. Some proposed that a sudden, localized seaquake could have rattled the ship violently enough to panic the crew. Others ventured into the territory of the improbable: sea monsters, mysterious whirlpools, even extraterrestrial involvement. Still, others suggested human treachery. Perhaps the captain had staged a disappearance for reasons unknown, or the crew had been lured away by another vessel under false pretenses. One persistent detail draws attention: the lifeboat's absence. In calm weather, abandoning a sound ship for a small boat would have been reckless. In stormy seas, it would have been suicidal. What could have convinced an experienced captain like Briggs to take such a step? Could a temporary hazard, fire, toxic fumes, or the sudden listing of the ship have seemed so urgent that he believed the Mary Celeste might explode or sink at any moment? The salvage hearing in Gibraltar, convened after the Dei Gratia brought the ship to port, only deepened the mystery. The court found no evidence of foul play, but hinted at the possibility of fraud without ever naming a culprit. In the end, the Mary Celeste was released to her owners, but the unanswered questions lingered like a shadow over her name. Even her later history offered no comfort. She returned to service, passing from one owner to another, but never shook the reputation of being cursed. In 1885, she was deliberately wrecked off Haiti in an insurance scam, ending her story in ignominy, but by then her legend was already firmly embedded in maritime lore. Looking back, the mystery is amplified by what wasn't found. No distress signal, no damage consistent with disaster, no survivors or bodies recovered. The ocean, vast and indifferent, had swallowed every trace of the human drama that unfolded on that deck. The ship herself seemed to drift on, caught between worlds, a vessel complete in every way except for the absence of the people who gave her purpose. Today, standing at a harbor and watching the masts of tall ships sway against the horizon, it is tempting to imagine the Mary Celeste as she appeared that day to the crew of the Dei Gratia, sails drawing wind, wheel unmanned, her logbook closed mid-journey. What compelled those aboard to leave safety for uncertainty? Did they perish within sight of land, their voices lost in the wind? Or did something stranger happen? Something that left no mark upon the ship, yet removed every soul from her decks. The Atlantic keeps her silence, and the Mary Celeste, adrift in both sea and memory, remains a ghost ship in the truest sense, her story as open and unclaimed as the waters where she was found. In a quiet corner of an Italian villa in 1912, among dust-covered chests and stacks of forgotten papers, an antiquarian named Wilfred Voynich made a discovery that would puzzle scholars for more than a century. It was a modestly sized book, bound in worn vellum, its pages thick with age. At first glance, it might have seemed like any other medieval manuscript, until he opened it. Inside were 240 pages filled with flowing script in an unknown language, written in a fluid, practiced hand. Not a single word could be matched to any known tongue. The text was accompanied by vivid illustrations, plants that seemed real yet unfamiliar, intricate astronomical charts, strange bathing women in greenish pools connected by winding pipes, and complex diagrams whose meaning was entirely unclear. Some pages folded out like maps, revealing sprawling networks of stars or interconnected botanical structures. Voynich quickly realized he had stumbled upon something exceptional. But where had it come from? The manuscript's history was hazy at best. A letter found with it, dated 1665, hinted that the book had once been in the possession of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who reportedly believed it to be the work of Roger Bacon, the 13th century English friar and scholar. If true, it had passed through the hands of alchemists, collectors, and scholars before vanishing from record for centuries, only to reappear in Voynich's hands. The text defied translation from the start. Linguists, cryptographers, and historians pored over the symbols, noting that the writing appeared structured, with consistent rules, suggesting it was a genuine language or an elaborate cipher. Yet no one could crack it. World War I codebreakers, adept at unraveling enemy communications, failed entirely. Later, Cold War-era cryptanalysts met with the same frustration. The script seemed to follow patterns, but without a key or any known reference point, its meaning remained locked away. The illustrations offered no easy answers. Some plants resembled known species. Others seemed like composites, as if drawn from imagination or a place unseen. The astronomical diagrams included zodiac symbols, but the arrangement of stars and moons defied standard medieval conventions. The pages depicting nude women in strange, organic-looking pools hinted at herbal medicine, astrology, or perhaps something more esoteric. Yet none of it aligned neatly with known traditions. Over time, theories emerged to explain both its content and its origin. Some scholars suggested it was an elaborate medical text, possibly a compendium of herbal remedies and astrological charts created for a specific noble patron. Others argued it could be a coded work of alchemy, its true knowledge concealed from all but the initiated. A few proposed it was an attempt to construct a universal language, long forgotten before its completion. Then came the more controversial ideas. Some suspected the entire manuscript was an elaborate hoax, crafted in the 15th or 16th century to impress or deceive a wealthy buyer like Rudolph II. In this view, the text was meaningless, its complexity a deliberate illusion. But if so, the sheer scale of the deception, requiring hundreds of pages of consistent, rule-based writing, would have demanded extraordinary effort and skill. Others have suggested that the Voynich manuscript may encode lost knowledge from a now vanished culture, perhaps passed down in secret before finding its way into European hands. And still, there are those who entertain the possibility, however remote, that it preserves knowledge from beyond our world. Scientific testing has at least anchored part of the mystery in time. Radiocarbon dating of the vellum places its creation between 1404 and 1438. This means the manuscript is authentically medieval, even if its content remains indecipherable. But knowing when it was made has not brought us closer to knowing why or by whom. The reappearance in 1912 only adds another layer of intrigue. Where had it been during those missing centuries? Who had kept it safe, and why had it never been catalogued or copied into other collections? Was its survival a matter of chance, or was it deliberately hidden until the right or wrong moment? Today, the manuscript resides in Yale University's Baynek Rare Book and Manuscript Library, where it is preserved under carefully controlled conditions. High-resolution scans allow anyone in the world to examine its pages, and amateur and professional code breakers alike continue to try their hand at unlocking its meaning. Yet, despite the efforts of some of the most brilliant cryptographers and AI-assisted analysis, the Voynich script remains stubbornly silent. Looking at its looping, graceful characters, one can almost imagine they were written for someone still yet to come. Someone who will understand instinctively what they mean. But perhaps the truth was never meant for us. Perhaps it lies buried in the mind of a long-dead author who assumed their readers would already know the key, or in a cultural context, lost entirely to time. Standing before the glass case that now holds the manuscript, the viewer is struck by the same feeling that must have gripped Wilfred Voynich in that Italian villa over a century ago, that here is a voice from the past speaking in a tongue we cannot hear. The question lingers, suspended between history and imagination. Is the Voynich manuscript a record of forgotten knowledge, or is it a puzzle without a solution, meant to keep its secret for all eternity? In the sweltering summer of 1518, the streets of Strasbourg bustled beneath the weight of the season. The Rhine shimmered in the distance, and the air was thick with the smell of bread ovens, livestock, and the river's damp breath. Merchants hawked their goods, children darted between stalls, and the great spires of the city loomed above a maze of narrow lanes. Life followed its familiar rhythm, until a lone woman stepped into the street and began to dance. Her name was Frau Trophäa. At first, her movement seemed deliberate, almost ceremonial. But the minutes passed, then hours, and she did not stop. No musicians played, no crowd urged her on. She danced with a strange, fixed determination, her feet pounding the cobblestones as the summer sun sank and rose again. By the week's end, more than 30 people had joined her, men, women, and children, each caught in the same relentless compulsion. They swayed and spun, arms flailing, eyes distant, their bodies trembling with exhaustion yet refusing to yield. Within a month, the number of dancers swelled into the hundreds. Witnesses spoke of people collapsing from sheer fatigue, some dying where they fell. Physicians and civic leaders, baffled by the phenomenon, turned to the medical theory of the time, an excess of hot blood that could be cured only by more dancing. The city erected a stage, hired musicians, and encouraged the afflicted to continue, hoping they would eventually dance themselves back to health. Instead, the frenzy deepened. Historical records, municipal accounts, sermons, and chronicles confirm the outbreak's scale, but they do not explain it. Why did so many people, over such a short period, succumb to the same uncontrollable impulse? Why did it happen here, and why then? One theory points to ergotism, a poisoning caused by consuming rye contaminated with the fungus Claviceps purpurea, which can induce hallucinations, convulsions, and mania. In an age before modern milling and storage, contaminated bread was not uncommon, and the symptoms of ergot poisoning could, in theory, produce compulsive movement. Yet this does not fully account for the synchronized, prolonged nature of the Strasbourg outbreak, or why it seemed to spread socially, as if by suggestion. Others have framed the event as a form of mass psychogenic illness, a collective psychological reaction to extreme stress. The early 16th century was a time of profound hardship for Strasbourg's citizens. Famine, disease, and crushing poverty pressed on the population, while the looming weight of religious tension cast long shadows. In this reading, the dancing was not a symptom of physical illness, but a manifestation of desperation, a cultural cry for release that spread through the tightly knit community. There are also religious interpretations, rooted in the beliefs of the time. Some contemporaries linked the outbreak to the wrath of Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr associated with both dance and protection from neurological disorders. In this view, the dancers were either cursed or compelled as a form of penance. Pilgrimages to the saint's shrine were organized, and relics were displayed in hopes of breaking the strange enchantment. More speculative ideas have emerged in modern retellings. Some suggest an ecstatic religious ritual gone wrong, its original purpose forgotten in the grip of hysteria. Others wonder whether the outbreak was sparked by a secretive cult or sect whose practices spiraled out of control. A few have even speculated on the role of unknown environmental factors, subtle toxins, weather patterns, or diseases that left no trace in the historical record. Yet for all these theories, the event remains stubbornly resistant to definitive explanation. The dancing plague of 1518 ended as strangely as it began. After weeks of unbroken movement, the afflicted gradually returned to normal life, some recovering, others succumbing to the physical toll. No further outbreaks of such magnitude occurred in Strasbourg, though smaller episodes of dancing mania were recorded elsewhere in Europe over the centuries. The surviving accounts are both vivid and frustratingly incomplete. Chroniclers described the eerie mix of joyless motion and human suffering, the way some dancers wept as they moved, others laughed, and many seemed trapped in a state beyond their own will. But there are gaps, details that were never written down or that have been lost to time. We do not know precisely how it started, what words were spoken among the dancers, or what they felt in their final moments of movement before collapse. Standing in Strasbourg today, where modern streets trace the same paths trodden 5 centuries ago, it is difficult to reconcile the everyday life of the city with the image of hundreds of people moving endlessly, day and night, until their bodies failed them. Was it illness? Was it mass hysteria? Or was it something stranger, an event that slipped between the boundaries of the physical and the psychological, the earthly and the spiritual? The records fall silent, but the image remains. A crowd of dancers in the shadow of the cathedral, the air thick with summer heat and the sound of shuffling feet, moving to a rhythm no one else could hear. And the question endures, as it has for centuries. What, in that hot summer of 1518, took hold of the people of Strasbourg so completely that they could not stop? In the vast expanse of the South Pacific, where the horizon melts into an unbroken band of sea and sky, a faint distress signal crackled across the radio waves. It was the late 1940s, exact year uncertain, and the message was terse, chilling. From an unidentified merchant vessel, later identified as the Ourang Medan, came a plea for help. All officers, including the captain, are dead, lying in chart room and on bridge, possibly whole crew dead. Then, after a pause of final fragmented transmission, I die. What followed was silence. The coordinates led nearby ships toward the Strait of Malacca, a narrow, busy waterway between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. Among the vessels to respond was the American freighter Silver Star. Hours later, her crew sighted the Ourang Medan, drifting aimlessly in calm seas. She bore no visible damage, her hull weathered but intact, her flag hanging limp in the still air. Boarding parties found the ship deathly silent. The first bodies were discovered on the bridge, officers sprawled across the deck, eyes wide open, mouths frozen in expressions of horror. In the chart room, the captain lay dead, his stiffened arm extended toward the door. Throughout the vessel, more crewmen were found, some on their backs, others collapsed mid-stride. Even the ship's dog was lifeless, teeth bared in an unnatural snarl. The details described by the rescuers are almost too strange to reconcile. There were no signs of injury, no evidence of a struggle. The corpses showed no wounds, yet their faces were twisted in terror, as though they had seen something unspeakable. The bodies were already in advanced rigor mortis, suggesting death had come suddenly and nearly simultaneously. The air aboard was stifling, oppressive, and, according to some accounts, tinged with the faint scent of burning. The ship's cargo holds were closed, but no one lingered long enough to explore them in detail. The rescuers, unsettled and wary, decided to tow the vessel to port for investigation. But before they could begin, smoke began to curl from below deck. Within minutes, flames erupted, driving the boarding parties back to the Silver Star. The fire spread rapidly, and moments after the tow line was cut, the Ourang Medan exploded with such force that she lifted from the water before sinking into the depths, taking with her whatever secrets she carried. What could have caused such a scene? Mainstream theories often begin with the possibility of hazardous cargo. Some suggest the ship may have been smuggling a volatile mixture of chemicals, perhaps potassium cyanide, nitroglycerin, or even nerve agents left over from wartime stockpiles. A leak could have filled the ship with toxic fumes, killing the crew swiftly and triggering the explosion that destroyed her. But this explanation leaves gaps. Why were the crew's bodies frozen in such expressions of horror, and why were no signs of panic or attempts at escape evident? Others point to carbon monoxide poisoning from a malfunctioning boiler. This could account for sudden, non-violent deaths, though it does little to explain the strange reports of fearful expressions or the rapid onset of rigor mortis. Then there are the more speculative possibilities. Some maritime storytellers invoke the idea of paranormal involvement, an encounter with something unseen that terrified the crew to death. The mention of burning smells and the lack of physical injuries have led a few to suggest electromagnetic or environmental phenomena, such as a sudden release of methane hydrate from the ocean floor, or an intense burst of solar activity affecting both human physiology and the ship's instruments. Skeptics, meanwhile, question whether the Ourang Medan existed at all. No definitive records of her construction, registration, or ownership have been found. The accounts we have are pieced together from later retellings, some printed in trade journals, others in sensationalized magazines. These inconsistencies lead some to argue that the story was a cautionary maritime fable, a way to warn sailors of the dangers of illicit cargo or poor ship maintenance. Yet those who believe in the incident point to the persistence of the details across multiple sources. The coordinates, the name of the responding ship, the description of the scene, all echo each other with unnerving consistency. If it was an invention, it was one that refused to fade, resurfacing decade after decade in reports and recollections. Even today, the exact origin of the Ourang Medan story remains murky. Some researchers trace it to a Dutch or East Asian registry, others to a post-war smuggling operation gone fatally wrong. Without the wreck, without official records, the truth is submerged as deeply as the ship itself. What haunts the imagination is the image of that silent vessel, adrift in tropical waters under an empty sky, her decks littered with the still forms of her crew. Whatever happened aboard was sudden, complete, and left no survivors to tell the tale. And when the sea finally claimed her, it ensured that no investigator could pry open her holds or read the last log entry. The waters of the Strait of Malacca are busy even now. Fishing boats, tankers, and cargo ships pass through daily. Somewhere beneath them may rest the bones of the Ourang Medan, her steel hull rusting in the dark, her story sealed in silt and salt. Was she the victim of dangerous cargo, an environmental catastrophe, or something far stranger, something that can only be guessed at in the absence of evidence? The ocean offers no answer. Only the final words of that desperate transmission remain, a voice lost in static. I die. And beyond them, the unbroken silence of the deep. In the summer of 1914, the streets of Sarajevo shimmered under the Balkan sun. The river Miljacka wound its way through the city, glinting between Ottoman-era bridges and Austro-Hungarian buildings. It was here, on June 28th, that Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, rode in an open car, unaware that within hours their journey would become one of history's most infamous tragedies. The shots fired by Gavrilo Princip not only ended their lives, but set into motion the First World War. Yet, what unfolded in the months and years afterward is less known. A pattern of strange and often untimely deaths among those connected to the Archduke, whether present that day or bound to him through personal or political ties. Some of these were men in uniform, others in courtly dress, politicians, officers, and attendants. Several died in the chaos of the war that followed, which was to be expected, but others met fates so abrupt and unlikely that they began to form a shadow narrative, whispered about in diplomatic circles and written between the lines of wartime correspondence. Consider Count Franz von Harrach, who had been in the motorcade on the day of the assassination. Though he initially survived the war, he died under unusual circumstances not long afterward, a hunting accident that some claimed was eerily reminiscent of the hunting fatality that had marked the Archduke's own family history years earlier. Then there was General Oskar Pocherek, the governor of Bosnia and Herzegovina, who had been riding in the same car as the Archduke when the shots were fired. Once a powerful figure in the empire, his career collapsed in disgrace after a disastrous military campaign. Within a few years, he too was gone, his death attributed to illness. But the rapid decline in his health was noted by more than one contemporary as sudden and complete. Several military aides-de-camp who had served the Archduke before the assassination perished during the war under circumstances that seemed to defy mere chance, killed in freak accidents away from the front lines, or succumbing to sudden virulent illnesses while in otherwise good health. The war claimed millions, yes, but the clustering of these particular deaths, men bound by proximity to the Archduke, invited speculation. What could account for such a pattern? On the surface, the simplest explanation is probability. The assassination was a flashpoint in a Europe already on the brink, and those in Franz Ferdinand's circle were naturally swept into the conflict's most dangerous currents. Soldiers die in war, leaders fall from favor and fade into obscurity. Yet others have wondered whether there was more at work. Could some of these deaths have been orchestrated? The assassination was the result of a conspiracy with multiple actors, nationalist groups, foreign agents, and local sympathizers all intertwined. Was it possible that loose ends were being tied off, inconvenient witnesses silenced in the years after the shots in Sarajevo? There is also the suggestion of a more intangible thread, a belief in a kind of curse surrounding the Habsburg heir. Superstitions had long circulated about the family: the mysterious death of Crown Prince Rudolf at Meierling in 1889, the assassination of Empress Elizabeth in 1898, and the string of political misfortunes that plagued the dynasty. Some whispered that Franz Ferdinand himself had been a target of fate long before Princip ever raised his pistol, and that those closest to him were simply caught in the same orbit. In the more speculative realm, a handful of writers have tied these events to the Archduke's personal views and political ambitions. Unlike many in the imperial court, Franz Ferdinand had advocated for greater autonomy for the Slavic peoples within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, an idea that earned him enemies both inside and outside its borders. Did these political tensions not only lead to his assassination, but also to a deliberate effort to erase his inner circle? Official histories tend to dismiss such theories, framing the subsequent deaths as part of the general upheaval and high mortality of the era. Yet, as with so many historical mysteries, it is the details, the coincidences, the peculiar timing that leave room for doubt. Why, for example, did certain deaths go unremarked in official records while others were given undue attention? And why did those who survived sometimes speak in guarded terms, as if reluctant to say too much? Today, Sarajevo's Latin Bridge, where Princip fired his fatal shots, is a place of quiet reflection. Tourists pass, cameras in hand, while the city hums on around it. Few pause to consider not only the spark that ignited the Great War, but also the quieter, more obscure shadows it cast. Shadows that seem to have followed those linked to the Archduke until their own abrupt ends. Were these deaths simply the product of war, politics, and the hazards of life in an unstable age? Or do they form a chain of cause and effect that has yet to be fully understood? Links in a story that extends beyond that single moment on a Sarajevo street in 1914. The answers, if they exist, remain buried in the tangle of history, where the truth may still lie waiting unseen. The fields around Mons, Belgium, are quiet now, patchworks of farmland stitched together by winding lanes and hedgerows. In late August 1914, however, they were anything but peaceful. The British Expeditionary Force, outnumbered and outgunned, faced the advancing German army in one of the first major engagements of the First World War. The air was thick with cordite and dust, the sharp rattle of rifle fire echoing against the low hills, while columns of smoke rose from villages caught between the lines. By the evening of August 23rd, the British forces were in retreat, pressed hard by a relentless enemy. Men marched and stumbled through exhaustion, their ranks thinning, their morale wearing thin. And then, according to some accounts, something strange happened. Stories began to circulate among soldiers that, in the chaos of the retreat, they had seen figures moving alongside them. Tall, luminous shapes, some described as winged, others as ghostly archers loosing arrows into the advancing Germans. Some claimed these figures stood between the retreating British and their pursuers, holding the enemy at bay. Others insisted they heard voices, calm, steady, reassuring, urging them onward, giving them the strength to keep moving when their bodies had nearly given out. The accounts varied in detail, but the heart of the story was always the same. In their darkest hour, the British soldiers had been aided, or at least accompanied, by something beyond the ordinary. The phenomenon quickly became known as the Angels of Mons. Historians note that the origins of the story may lie in a work of fiction. Just days after the battle, Welsh writer Arthur Machen published a short story titled The Bowman in the Evening News. It told of ghostly archers from the Battle of Agincourt appearing to aid British troops at Mons. Though Machen had presented it as pure invention, the tale resonated so strongly with the public, and perhaps with soldiers desperate for meaning in the slaughter, that many began retelling it as fact. Some claim to have heard similar stories before Machen's work was published. suggesting that the fiction may have tapped into an existing rumor rather than creating it from nothing. From there, the accounts spread, evolving as they were passed along. Some versions dropped the archers entirely, replacing them with angelic beings clad in white, their wings shimmering in the smoke. Others described a blinding light that shielded the British from enemy fire. In yet more, the figures were not angelic at all, but shadowy, faceless guardians who stood silently between the two armies. The mainstream explanation is that the angels of Mons were a combination of wartime propaganda, misinterpretation, and the effects of extreme fatigue. Soldiers under intense stress, deprived of sleep, food, and water, are prone to hallucinations. Add the haze of smoke, shifting light, and the charged atmosphere of battle, and it is easy to imagine figures taking shape in the mind's eye. The story's rapid spread, fueled by newspapers and church sermons, may have cemented it as truth in the minds of those who needed it to be true. And yet not all dismiss it so easily. Some researchers point to first-hand testimonies given long after the war, from soldiers who maintained that what they saw was no trick of light. These men insisted they had been in full control of their senses, and that the figures were as real to them as the enemy across the field. There is also the question of the Germans. Though there is no solid evidence, a few anecdotal accounts suggest that some German soldiers reported hesitating or falling back during the pursuit, claiming they, too, had seen something unusual on the British line. If such reports were genuine, they might indicate that whatever happened was not solely the product of British imagination. Speculative theories range from the spiritual to the supernatural. Some see the event as divine intervention, a sign that the British cause had heavenly favor in the war's early days. Others place it in the realm of the paranormal, suggesting the appearance of battlefield apparitions, whether echoes of history, as in Machen's fictional archers, or something entirely separate from human conflict. Still others take a psychological view, proposing that the angels of Mons were a shared vision born of collective desperation, an act of the mind, but one so powerful that it became, in effect, real for those who experienced it. In this way, the angels were neither wholly fictional nor truly supernatural. They were the product of belief itself, taking form in the crucible of survival. Today, the story occupies an uncertain space between history and legend. The battlefield of Mons is marked by cemeteries and memorials, but no physical evidence of the angels remains, only the words of those who claim to have seen them. In the stillness of the fields, it is difficult to imagine the chaos, the noise, and the fear that might give rise to such a vision. Yet perhaps that is precisely why the tale endures. It offers a moment of light in a war remembered mostly for its darkness. Was it a fabrication, born from a writer's imagination and magnified by rumor? Was it a hallucination, shared by weary men on the brink of collapse? Or did something truly inexplicable happen on those August days in 1914, something that stood between life and death, between defeat and survival? The fields of Mons keep their silence, and the angels, if they were ever there, have never returned. In the summer of 1917, the quiet village of Cottingley in West Yorkshire, England, seemed far removed from the turmoil of the Great War. Rolling green hills framed the narrow lanes, and the gentle sound of a stream carried through the gardens. It was here, in this seemingly ordinary setting, that two young cousins, Elsie Wright, 16, and Francis Griffiths, 9, produced a set of photographs that would ignite one of the most famous and enduring debates in the history of photography. The first image showed Frances, standing ankle-deep in a shaded glen, her gaze turned toward a cluster of delicate winged figures dancing on the grass before her. The fairies, captured mid-motion, seemed to hover effortlessly, their wings translucent in the sunlight. A second photograph, taken weeks later, depicted Elsie seated on the grass as a small fairy offered her a posy of flowers. The girls claimed the photographs were genuine. that they had seen and interacted with fairies along the stream behind the right home. Their families were amused at first, dismissing the images as harmless play. But the photographs carried a curious quality. They were sharply focused, free of the double exposures or obvious retouching common in photographic trickery of the time. When the prints came to the attention of the Theosophical Society in 1919, they caused a stir. The movement, which embraced mystical and spiritualist ideas, saw the photographs as possible evidence of a hidden world existing alongside our own. Soon, the images reached the desk of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, and an ardent believer in spiritual phenomena. He was captivated. For Doyle, the photographs offered not only proof of fairies, but also a glimmer of hope in an age scarred by war and loss, a sign that the world still held beauty and mystery beyond the reach of human destruction. By 1920, the photographs were published in the Strand magazine, accompanied by Doyle's own article. The reaction was polarized. Some readers marveled at the images, convinced that no mere children could have faked such lifelike figures. Others were skeptical, pointing to the fairies' oddly fashionable hairstyles and poses, which seemed suspiciously in step with Edwardian illustration styles. Experts examined the negatives. While photographic specialists of the day confirmed that the images showed no signs of tampering, they could not explain how the figures had been introduced into the scene. Critics argued they were paper cutouts, skillfully posed and supported with hat pins or wire. But without direct proof, the matter remained unresolved. The girls themselves offered little fuel for either camp. Francis maintained that the fairies were real but avoided public attention. Elsie, older and more forthright, deflected questions with a mixture of humor and vagueness. Over time, their reluctance to discuss the photographs only deepened the sense of mystery. Decades later, the case was revisited. In the 1980s, both Elsie and Francis admitted that most of the photographs had indeed been staged using cardboard cutouts based on popular fairy illustrations. Yet, intriguingly, Francis insisted until her death that one photograph, the fifth and final image, was genuine. Why cling to this claim after conceding the others were fakes? Was it sentimentality, or did she truly believe one moment had been real? Beyond the mechanics of the photographs lies another layer of intrigue, the cultural moment in which they emerged. Britain in the late 1910s was a nation steeped in grief, its people searching for comfort after years of devastating war and the Spanish flu pandemic. Belief in spiritualism surged, with seances, ghost photographs, and psychic mediums offering hope that life continued beyond death. The Cottingley photographs arrived like a gift to this yearning, a reminder that not all mysteries were grim, that wonder itself might be alive and tangible. There is also the question of motive. If the girls had intended a hoax, why maintain the illusion for decades, even in private? Did they fear disappointing Conan Doyle, whose faith in the images became so public? Or did they, in some part of themselves, wish to preserve the magic they had created, letting the world decide for itself? Modern analysis of the photographs leaves little doubt that the fairies were cutouts. Yet even with high-resolution scans and digital enhancement, the charm of the images remains strangely intact. Perhaps that is why the story still resonates. It is not just about the photographs, but about the enduring human desire to believe in what lies just beyond our perception. Standing in the leafy glen today, where the stream runs softly over moss-covered stones, it is easy to imagine how two young girls, surrounded by the stillness of nature, might have felt inspired to bring their own imagined world to life. Yet the lingering question is not merely whether the photographs were real, but why, after all these years, we still care to ask. Was the Cottingley affair simply a clever trick that grew beyond its creator's control? Or was it something more? A fleeting encounter with the unknown, preserved in grainy black and white. The images endure, not because they prove the existence of fairies, but because they remind us how thin the veil can be between the ordinary and the extraordinary, and how easily it can be lifted. On a clear day in the early 20th century, the rolling hills of northern Italy were alive with the hum of modern progress. Steam locomotives cut across the countryside, linking once isolated towns with the wider world. Among them was the pride of a newly expanded railway, an elegant passenger train operated by the Zanetti Company. Painted in deep green with polished brass fittings, it promised comfort and efficiency for its select passengers. On this particular journey, a small group of travelers boarded in Rome, bound for a scenic route through the mountains toward Lombardy. The trip began without incident. The train glided smoothly through the patchwork of fields and stone-built villages, its rhythm steady, its promise of arrival certain. But somewhere along the line, according to the most enduring version of the story, it was last seen entering a tunnel and never emerging. The tale, as it has come down to us, is fragmented and elusive. Reports claim that railway staff and witnesses at the far end of the tunnel waited for the train's arrival, but it did not appear. Search parties entered the tunnel expecting to find a derailment or mechanical failure. Instead, they found nothing. No carriages, no debris, no passengers. The train had simply vanished into the darkness. Mainstream explanations, for those who entertain the account at all, suggest confusion or exaggeration in the retelling. Early rail networks were prone to delays, misrouting, or temporary sidings that could remove a train from the expected track. Poor record-keeping or wartime disruptions in the first decades of the century might have muddled the facts. Yet even allowing for these possibilities, the absence of any record of the train's safe arrival or of a disaster remains puzzling. More speculative versions of the story push beyond the realm of simple error. Some say the Zanetti train slipped into an unrecorded spur or abandoned line within the tunnel, its passengers disembarking into a place from which they never returned. Others whisper of geological instability, landslides or subsidence sealing part of the tunnel behind them, creating a hidden chamber where time and decay claimed the train unnoticed. And then there are the stranger accounts, that the train and its passengers entered not just the tunnel, but some kind of rift, an unexplained atmospheric or geological anomaly that shifted them out of our time or even our world. In these tellings, the train has been sighted in improbable places and eras, its passengers confused and frightened, wearing the fashions of a vanished age. Skeptics dismiss these reports as urban legend. The earliest written accounts of the Zanetti disappearance surfaced decades after the supposed event, often in newspapers and magazines fond of sensational stories. The lack of corroborating railway documents is a significant obstacle for historians. Still, there are elements that keep the mystery alive: the persistence of details across different retellings, the specificity of the train's route, and the eerie familiarity of the image, a vehicle entering a confined space and simply never coming out. It is perhaps this image that resonates most. The idea of a tunnel as both a gateway and a trap is deeply rooted in our imagination. In the Zanetti case, the tunnel becomes a threshold between certainty and the unknown. One moment, a tangible, mechanical reality. The next, an absence impossible to reconcile with the facts of the physical world. Could the story have grown from a real incident? Perhaps a partial collapse, a wartime cover-up, or a reallocation of rolling stock disguised to avoid public concern? Or is it wholly a product of rumor, a fiction passed along so many times that it has gained the weight of history? The truth, if it exists, is hidden somewhere in the space between faulty memory and the records that were never made, or were quietly erased. Today, the precise location of the supposed tunnel is debated. Some point to disused lines in the Lombardy region, others to tunnels long sealed in the Apennine foothills. Railway historians sift through maps and timetables, hoping to match the legend with a real piece of infrastructure. But so far, the tracks lead only into uncertainty. And so, the Zanetti train remains a ghost of the rails, its green paint gleaming in the mind's eye, its brass fittings warm to the touch, its passengers unaware that they are about to cross a threshold from which there will be no return. Did it vanish into a mundane error, lost to time? Or did it, for one fleeting moment, find a passage to somewhere far stranger? The tunnel, if it still exists, holds its silence, and whatever passed into it has yet to emerge. London in the late 1830s was a city of contrasts, gas lamps casting halos of light on cobbled streets while shadows pooled in narrow alleys. The refined facades of the wealthy standing only a few streets away from the grime and grit of the working poor. It was in this atmosphere, thick with fog and rumor, that a figure emerged who would terrify and perplex the public for decades. A strange, leaping apparition known only as Spring-Heeled Jack. The first widely reported sighting occurred in 1837. A young servant girl named Mary Stevens was walking through Clapham Common when a tall, cloaked figure leapt from the darkness. She claimed he grasped her with cold, clammy hands and attempted to kiss her, his touch unnatural, his breath suffused with a strange, metallic smell. She screamed, and the assailant bounded away with impossible speed, vanishing into the night. Soon after, in January 1838, the phenomenon took on a more sinister shape. Jane Alsop, living in London's East End, answered a knock at her door to find a man claiming to be a police officer. He asked for a light, saying he had caught Spring-Heeled Jack nearby. When she returned with a candle, the figure threw back his cloak, revealing a hideous, distorted face, glowing eyes, and the ability to breathe blue and white flames. He clawed at her clothing before retreating into the darkness, leaping over a high garden wall as easily as a man stepping off a curb. The newspapers seized on the story. Reports multiplied, of a caped figure with the agility to jump great distances, sometimes across rooftops, sometimes clearing high fences in a single bound. Witnesses described him as wearing a helmet or tight-fitting oilskin suit, with talon-like fingers and an otherworldly laugh. In some cases, he assaulted women. In others, he seemed content to terrify by his mere appearance, springing away before anyone could lay hands on him. The authorities, pressured by public fear, offered rewards for his capture, yet no one was ever conclusively identified. Some believed Spring-Heeled Jack was nothing more than a cruel prankster, possibly an athletic aristocrat with access to specialized equipment, such as spring-loaded boots or experimental climbing gear. Others speculated that multiple copycats, inspired by the newspapers, kept the sightings alive. And yet, the reports did not fade quickly. They spread beyond London, to the Midlands, to Liverpool, and even to small rural towns. In 1877, Army barracks at Aldershot reported a strange intruder who startled sentries by leaping into view, slapping one soldier, and then escaping with a bound over the guard's head. His leaps were said to cover more than 10 feet at a time, an athletic feat remarkable even today. By the turn of the century, the sightings had grown less frequent but no less strange. In 1904, residents of Liverpool reported a figure resembling the old descriptions, tall, thin, caped, and moving with astonishing agility, leaping from street to street before vanishing into the night. After that, the trail went cold. What was Spring-Heeled Jack? The rational explanations are many. He could have been an eccentric nobleman. Lord Henry Beresford, known for elaborate pranks, was one suspect, using disguise and physical prowess to shock and amuse himself at the public's expense. The flame breathing could be explained by alcohol ignition tricks known to entertainers of the era, while his leaps might have been exaggerated in the retelling. The Victorian press, ever hungry for sensational stories, may have inflated details to keep readers enthralled. And yet other aspects remain harder to dismiss. The sheer geographical spread of sightings, spanning decades, suggests something more than a single prankster. Could the phenomenon have been a kind of enduring urban legend, fueled by fear and imagination, with isolated incidents misattributed to the same figure? Or was there truly someone, or something, capable of such feats, whose identity was never uncovered? A few more speculative theories push the boundaries further. Some have suggested that Spring healed Jack's abilities, particularly his prodigious leaps and glowing eyes, hint at technology or knowledge far ahead of its time, perhaps an experimental device lost to history. Others, leaning into the supernatural, cast him as a folkloric figure reborn in the industrial age, a trickster spirit or demonic entity taking delight in unsettling a city in the throes of rapid change. Even now, the mystery lingers in the edges of history. The surviving police reports, though sparse, align closely with the most sensational press accounts, lending the legend a foundation of credibility. No definitive suspect was ever named, no final sighting confirmed. Like the gaslit streets he once haunted, Spring-heeled Jack remains half in shadow, a blend of documented fact and unresolvable speculation. And so we are left to wonder, was he flesh and blood, a clever and agile man who slipped through the cracks of history? Or was he something else entirely, a phantom born of fear, gossip, and the restless imagination of a city at the dawn of modernity? The streets he once leapt across have long since changed, but perhaps, somewhere in the restless corners of London's night, the echo of his bounding steps can still be heard. The winter of Petrograd in 1916 was unforgiving, snow falling in heavy silence over the frozen Neva, the streets muffled beneath drifts, and the black spires of the city's churches piercing a leaden sky. It was a city on the brink, frayed by the pressures of war, political intrigue, and famine. Inside the Yusupov Palace, however, the night was alive with a different kind of tension. Candles flickered in polished sconces, their light glinting off gilded moldings. In the basement dining room, a table was set for an unusual guest, Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin. Rasputin was no stranger to controversy. To some, he was a holy man, a mystic healer whose influence over Tsarina Alexandra was tied to his ability to ease the suffering of her hemophiliac son, Alexei. To others, he was a dangerous charlatan whose proximity to the royal family threatened the stability of the empire. His name had become a rallying cry for critics of the monarchy, and his rumored excesses, drunkenness, womanizing, political manipulation, only added fuel to the fire. On the night of December 29th, old style, Rasputin accepted an invitation from Prince Felix Yusupov. The prince's stated purpose was friendly: music, conversation, perhaps a late supper. In truth, it was part of a plot. Several conspirators, including Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich and politician Vladimir Purishkevich, had decided that Rasputin's death was necessary to save Russia from collapse. According to the official account given by Yusupov, the murder unfolded in a series of almost unbelievable stages. In the candlelit basement, Rasputin was offered cakes and wine laced with potassium cyanide, enough, supposedly, to kill several men. Yet Yusupov claimed Rasputin ate and drank freely, showing no signs of distress. Hours passed. The conspirators, growing desperate, resorted to violence. Yusupov returned to the basement with a revolver and shot Rasputin in the chest. Believing him dead, they began to discuss how to dispose of the body, but Yusupov later swore that Rasputin stirred, rose to his feet, and lunged toward the door. He ran into the courtyard, pursued by Purishkevich, who fired several shots, 2 striking their target. Even then, the mad monk struggled, according to the conspirators, until finally collapsing. His body was bound, wrapped, and carried to a bridge over the frozen Neva, where it was dropped into a hole in the ice. When Rasputin's corpse was recovered days later, autopsy reports, though conflicting, added more fuel to the mystery. Some versions suggested water in the lungs, implying he was still alive when submerged. Others recorded no such evidence. The number and placement of the bullet wounds varied between accounts, as did the presence of poison. Official documentation from the autopsy has never fully resolved these contradictions, and some records disappeared during the revolution that followed. From these uncertainties, speculation flourished. Was Yusupov's dramatic telling an embellishment meant to enhance the conspirators' courage? Or was Rasputin truly as difficult to kill as legend claims? Could the cyanide have lost its potency if baked, rendering the initial attempt harmless? Or did the poisoner intentionally omit it, preferring to rely on bullets to ensure the deed? There are darker theories still. Some historians have proposed that British intelligence may have had a hand in the killing. Rasputin had reportedly urged the Tsarina to push for peace with Germany, an outcome that would have freed German troops from the Eastern Front and endangered Britain's position in the war. Was the erratic mystic eliminated not only by Russian nobles but with foreign assistance, his death masked by the chaos of the conspirator's tale? And what of Rasputin's own foreboding prophecy, written weeks before his death? In a letter to Tsar Nicholas II, he warned that if he were killed by commoners, the monarchy would endure, but if he died at the hands of nobles, the Romanov dynasty would fall within 2 years. The words proved eerily accurate. Less than 15 months later, the Tsar abdicated. Within 2 years, the royal family was executed in Ekaterinburg. Today, the Yusupov Palace still stands, its basement restored to the appearance it held on that fateful night. Tourists can walk the same narrow corridor, stand before the same heavy door, and imagine the moment when the plotters believed they had finally rid themselves of the man they saw as a corrupting force. And yet, for all the retellings, the truth remains elusive. Did Rasputin's death play out as Yusupov described, a near-mythic struggle against fate? Or was it a simpler, more clinical killing later shrouded in dramatic flourish to capture the public imagination? In the end, Rasputin's death is a puzzle with too many missing pieces, contradictory testimonies, vanished records, and a legend that grew faster than the facts could be confirmed. What is certain is that his end did not halt the unraveling of the Russian Empire. If anything, it signaled that the final collapse was already underway. Yet the lingering question endures, whispering through the cold halls of the Yusupov Palace and across the ice of the Neva. Was Rasputin merely a man undone by political enemies? Or did something about him, his influence, his presence, his very being, make his death as strange and enduring as the life he lived? The waters off the Isle of Wight can seem deceptively gentle. Broad, open stretches of the English Channel that on calm days shimmer with a silvery light. But on March 24, 1878, those waters turned treacherous with little warning. HMS Eurydice, a 26-gun Royal Navy corvette returning from a training voyage in the West Indies, sailed toward Portsmouth under full sail. The day was bright, the wind steady, and the cliffs of the island were already in sight. For the men aboard, more than 300 officers and crew, it must have felt like the journey's end was finally in reach. Then the weather changed. Without warning, a fierce Arctic squall swept in from the northeast, bringing snow, freezing temperatures, and winds strong enough to rip sails from their rigging. In minutes, the Eurydice was caught broadside, her masts groaning under the force of the gale. She heeled sharply, water rushing across her decks. In the chaos, she took on water faster than the pumps could clear it. Within half an hour, the ship had capsized and sunk, dragging most of her crew down into the icy depths. Only 2 men survived. The disaster shocked Britain. The Eurydice had been a symbol of naval strength and discipline, and her loss, so close to home waters, felt almost incomprehensible. Salvage operations later raised her hull, revealing the extent of the damage, but the explanations offered by naval inquiry, while logical in terms of weather and seamanship, did little to soothe the public imagination. In the years that followed, a stranger chapter to the Eurydice story began to unfold. Sailors, fishermen, and even passengers aboard passing vessels began reporting sightings of a fully rigged ship gliding silently through the waters off the Isle of Wight, its sails billowing, its form startlingly clear, yet its movements eerily smooth. Some claimed the ship vanished abruptly when approached, dissolving into mist or fading into the horizon. Others swore they saw figures on deck, motionless, pale, and dressed in the uniform of the late 19th century Royal Navy. One of the most well-known accounts came decades later, when submariner Commander F. Lipscomb claimed to have seen the Phantom while sailing past the same stretch of coast. He described the ship in detail, identifying her unmistakably as the Eurydice, even though she had been lying at the bottom of the channel for many years. Could these sightings be illusions? Maritime historians often point to atmospheric phenomena such as fata morgana, mirages caused by layers of warm and cold air bending light and projecting distant ships into the sky or onto the horizon. The English Channel, with its variable weather, is no stranger to such effects. A ship far out at sea might appear magnified and displaced, creating the impression of a ghostly vessel hovering just offshore. And yet, the Eurydice reports often contain details inconsistent with known vessels in the area at the time. Witnesses claimed her sail configuration matched that of the Eurydice on the day she was lost, full canvas unfurled, despite the worsening weather, and that the ship appeared startlingly close, sometimes only a few hundred yards away. Could so many unrelated observers have mistaken an ordinary vessel for the same long-lost corvette? There is also the curious persistence of the legend. While many ghost ship stories fade over time, sightings of the Eurydice continued well into the 20th century, told by seasoned sailors who had little to gain from repeating such tales. Some even claimed the phantom ship was an omen, that those who saw her would encounter misfortune at sea soon after. In the more speculative corners of maritime lore, the Eurydice's apparitions are seen as a kind of residual haunting, the final moments of her ill-fated voyage imprinted on the waters where she sank. If such an imprint exists, does it replay endlessly, a loop of sail and wind and disaster that can be glimpsed only under the right conditions? Or is the legend itself what endures, a story so embedded in local memory that it colors perception, shaping what people think they see? Standing on the cliffs of the Isle of Wight today, looking out over the shifting waters, it's not difficult to imagine how the mind might conjure the outline of a ship in the interplay of sunlight, mist, and wave. But it's equally easy to picture the real Eurydice on that March afternoon, her crew fighting the wind, the snow blinding their eyes, the shore so close and yet already beyond their reach. The wreck lies silent now, but the legend sails on. Was the phantom Eurydice ever truly seen, her decks manned by the shades of those lost in the squall? Or is her ghost no more than a reflection of our own fascination with the thin, shifting line between history and myth? The sea, as always, keeps its secrets. In the twilight skies of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, long before powered flight was commonplace, strange shapes began to appear. Silent, elongated forms drifting against the evening clouds, their outlines just discernible in the fading light. This was the Belle Époque, an era of elegance and optimism in Europe and the United States, but also a time of rapid technological change, where the boundaries between the possible and the impossible seemed to blur. It was in this atmosphere that reports of mysterious phantom airships began to spread. The first major wave occurred in the winter of 1896 to 1897 in the United States. when newspapers from California to the Midwest began carrying eyewitness accounts. Farmers, policemen, and city dwellers alike described large, cigar-shaped craft moving slowly overhead, often equipped with bright searchlights that swept the ground below. Some claimed to hear the sound of engines or voices. Others said the vessels hovered in complete silence. In a few extraordinary reports, witnesses claimed to see human figures aboard, sometimes waving down to those on the ground. The sightings soon crossed the Atlantic. By the early 1900s, similar craft were being reported in Britain, New Zealand, and parts of mainland Europe. This phantom airship wave reached another peak in 1912 to 1913, particularly in the British Isles. These later sightings came at a time of growing political tension, and many in the press speculated that the mysterious craft were advanced German Zeppelins conducting clandestine reconnaissance. Yet the German government denied any such activity, and no conclusive evidence ever emerged to support the theory. Descriptions of the airships varied, but certain elements recurred: long, cylindrical hulls, powerful forward-facing lights, and the ability to maneuver in ways that seemed far ahead of known aviation capabilities of the day. This was years before the Wright brothers' first powered flight in 1903 became widely recognized, and decades before large, rigid airships would be seen in regular operation. How could these advanced craft exist in such numbers without official acknowledgement? Mainstream explanations for the sightings tend to focus on misidentification. In the 1890s and early 1900s, experimental balloons and early dirigibles were being built by inventors in both Europe and America. Some of these were privately funded projects, their trials conducted in semi-secrecy. A few may have been witnessed by chance, inspiring exaggerated retellings in newspapers hungry for sensational stories. The bright lights, meanwhile, could have been lanterns or early electric lamps, their beams magnified by atmospheric conditions. Another plausible explanation lies in the psychology of the times. The Belle Époque was a period when science, engineering, and exploration captured the public imagination. News of each new invention spread quickly, and people were primed to expect, and perhaps to see, marvels in the sky. A strange light or shadow could be transformed in the mind of an observer into a fully formed airship, especially when reinforced by repeated stories in the press. Yet some details defy easy dismissal. A number of reports came from experienced observers, mariners, engineers, or military personnel accustomed to judging distance and speed. Some of these accounts included maneuvers that seemed too precise for the lighter-than-air craft of the day, such as abrupt changes in direction or acceleration against the wind. A few witnesses even claimed the craft ascended vertically at great speed, vanishing into the clouds. In more speculative circles, the phantom airships have been linked to the idea of mystery inventors, individuals or small groups who had achieved breakthroughs in propulsion or aerodynamics far ahead of their contemporaries. If such inventors existed, why did their technology vanish from history? Were their designs suppressed, lost, or perhaps so flawed that they could not be developed further? Others reach further still, suggesting the airships were not human inventions at all. Some modern researchers have reinterpreted the sightings as an early wave of what would later be called UFO phenomena, adapted to the technological imagery of the era. In this view, the craft appeared in forms familiar enough to be accepted by contemporary witnesses, hence their resemblance to dirigibles rather than to the more unconventional shapes reported in later decades. Whatever their origin, the phantom airship wave faded almost as suddenly as it began. By the start of the First World War in 1914, sightings became rare, replaced by reports of real military aircraft. The great airship programs of Germany, Britain, and other nations would soon dominate the skies in full view of the public, and the earlier mystery craft slipped into the realm of legend. Today, the reports survive in old newspaper archives, private diaries and local histories. Some read like fanciful fiction. Others carry the matter-of-fact tone of a witness simply describing what they saw. Together, they paint a picture of a world on the cusp of flight, glimpsing shapes in the sky that seem to come from the future or from somewhere else entirely. Were these phantom airships the work of pioneering inventors whose names have been lost to time? Were they misperceptions, amplified by a public eager for technological wonders? Or were they something more enigmatic, an early chapter in a mystery that still plays out in our skies today? The answers remain elusive, hidden somewhere between history, imagination, and the vast uncharted air above. In the rolling countryside of Suffolk, England, the village of Woolpit still sits much as it did centuries ago, its name a reminder of the deep pits once used to trap wolves. In the 12th century, these same pits, set amid open fields and hedgerows, were the setting for a story that would pass from medieval chronicles into the realm of enduring mystery. One day, according to accounts from the period, villagers working near the pits discovered two children, a boy and a girl, emerging from the earth itself. They appeared disoriented, speaking in a language no one recognized. Their clothing was made from an unfamiliar material, woven in a style unseen in the region, and their skin, to the astonishment of all, was a distinct shade of green. Chroniclers such as Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh recorded what they heard from witnesses. The children refused all food for several days until they were offered raw broad beans, which they ate greedily. Over time, they adapted to the local diet, and as the months passed, the green tint to their skin faded. The boy, however, became sickly and died soon after baptism. The girl survived, grew to adulthood, learned English, and reportedly integrated into local society. It was through her eventual account, filtered through the ears of her questioners, that the strangest details emerged. She claimed she and her brother came from a place where the light was dim, as if perpetual twilight reigned, and where all the people shared their greenish skin tone. She spoke of a land of St. Martin, and of hearing a loud noise before finding themselves suddenly by the wolf pits, disoriented and afraid. How to explain such a tale in the context of the 12th century? The most common theory among historians is that the children were Flemish immigrants, orphans displaced during a period of unrest, who had wandered into Woolpit from the nearby countryside. Malnutrition or a dietary deficiency such as chlorosis could have temporarily tinted their skin. Their strange clothing and language might simply have been foreign to the local villagers, and the dim land could have been a metaphor for a forested or shaded valley. Yet this interpretation struggles to account for certain details. The children were reportedly found near deep pits and described as having emerged from the earth. Could they have been hiding in the pits, or did the villagers exaggerate this image to emphasize their sudden and mysterious appearance? And what of their own story? Did it reflect a literal memory of a place unknown to medieval England, or was it shaped by the girl's attempts to communicate her past in a new tongue? In more speculative circles, the green children of Woolpit have been linked to folklore about hidden worlds and otherworldly visitors. Some see their story as a variant of the fairy abduction motif, in which mortals pass between our world and an underground realm. Others have gone further, suggesting the children were survivors of some lost or isolated human community, or even visitors from another world entirely, interpreting their unusual skin color and sudden displacement through the lens of modern extraterrestrial speculation. A more symbolic reading sees the tale as an allegory, preserved in local memory and later written down by chroniclers who blended fact and legend. In this view, the green children might never have existed as literal individuals, but instead embodied themes of strangeness, assimilation, and the crossing of cultural boundaries, concerns that would have resonated in a medieval England shaped by Norman conquest, migration, and shifting identities. And yet, the historical records remain tantalizingly specific. Both Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh were respected chroniclers, not known for fabricating outright fantasies, and they recorded the story within decades of its supposed occurrence. While they freely admitted they could not explain it, they seemed convinced that something unusual had indeed taken place in Woolpit. Today, the village retains echoes of the story in its local heritage, and the Green Children remain a subject of fascination for historians, folklorists, and mystery seekers alike. The site of the old wolf pits has long since changed, the landscape softened by centuries of farming, but it is still possible to stand in the fields and imagine two children speaking a language no one understands, stepping hesitantly into the light of a world they had never known. Were they lost travelers from a nearby village, their strangeness magnified by time and retelling, survivors of an unknown community? Or did they truly come from a place beyond the ordinary boundaries of our world, a place where the sun never fully rose and the people bore the green of that eternal twilight in their skin? The answer, if it exists, lies buried deep in the centuries between their arrival and our own time, leaving only the story and the question. In the spring of 1876, the Priory, an elegant house in the London suburb of Balham, stood behind manicured gardens and wrought-iron gates, a picture of Victorian respectability. Inside, its high-ceilinged rooms were appointed with fine furniture and heavy drapes, the air scented faintly with polished wood and coal smoke. Yet, on the evening of April 18th, this calm facade would give way to a scene of confusion and dread that would baffle investigators for generations. Charles Bravo, a 30-year-old barrister, had been married only a few months to Florence Ricardo, a wealthy widow with a complicated past. Their marriage was, by all outward appearances, a respectable union, but behind closed doors it was strained, plagued by quarrels over money, independence, and household control. On that April evening, Bravo suddenly collapsed after dinner, gripped by agonizing cramps and vomiting. His condition worsened rapidly, and a doctor was summoned. Over the next 2 days, Bravo suffered intense pain, drifting in and out of consciousness. Medical examination revealed the cause: antimony poisoning, specifically tartar emetic, a substance often used in small doses as a medicine, but deadly in larger quantities. When questioned, Bravo offered no explanation for how he had ingested the poison, insisting he had taken nothing unusual. On April 21st, he died, leaving behind more questions than answers. The inquest that followed riveted Victorian society. The coroner's court delved into the tangled web of relationships within the Priory. Florence's past became a point of scrutiny. Before marrying Bravo, she had been involved with the much older physician Dr. James Gully, a respected but controversial figure in homeopathic medicine. Their affair, though ended before her marriage, had been scandalous in polite society and was rumored to still cast a shadow over her new life. Then there was the housekeeper, Mrs. Jane Cox, a loyal servant to Florence who had her own tensions with Bravo. Witnesses testified that relations between master and staff had been sour. Bravo had reportedly threatened to dismiss Mrs. Cox, which could have left her in financial difficulty. The possibilities multiplied. Had Florence, unhappy in her marriage, slipped poison into his drink or medicine? Had Mrs. Cox acted to protect her mistress, or out of resentment? Or was Bravo himself the architect of his fate, taking the poison intentionally, perhaps in an impulsive act during a heated argument? The idea of suicide was considered, but many argued it was inconsistent with his behavior. Bravo had a promising legal career and, by some accounts, was ambitious and eager to assert control over his new household. The evidence was frustratingly circumstantial. No one had seen the poison administered, and no container or residue was definitively linked to the fatal dose. The inquest's jury returned an open verdict, concluding only that Charles Bravo had died from antimony poisoning, but without determining whether it was murder, suicide, or accident. Over time, the case took on the quality of a locked room mystery. 3 main suspects, each with motive and opportunity, yet no proof against any. Historians and criminologists have revisited the events repeatedly. Some argue that Florence, facing the loss of her autonomy in the marriage and perhaps fearing Bravo's temper, acted in desperation. Others suggest Mrs. Cox, fearing dismissal, sought to rid the household of the man threatening her livelihood. A smaller group maintains that Bravo may have dosed himself, either as a misguided attempt to make himself ill and elicit sympathy, or as a deliberate escape from a marital standoff gone too far. In more speculative corners, the case has been viewed through the lens of Victorian attitudes toward gender, class, and respectability. Was the truth obscured by the reluctance of the jury to fully implicate a woman of Florence's standing, or by an unwillingness to tarnish the reputation of a rising barrister without clear evidence? Did the social dynamics of the time prevent witnesses from speaking openly about what they knew? The priory itself no longer stands, but the mystery of its most infamous night persists. The poison that killed Charles Bravo acted swiftly, but the ripples of his death spread slowly, embedding themselves in the annals of unsolved Victorian crime. Standing in Balham today, among the quiet residential streets, it is hard to picture the fevered speculation that once gripped London over this genteel house and its fatal secret. Yet the questions remain as sharp as they were in 1876. Who placed the poison in Bravo's path? And why? Or was his end the result of his own hidden choices? The answers are lost to time, but the case endures, a reminder that even in an age obsessed with propriety and order, some truths could slip forever beyond reach. Off the coast of Massachusetts, where the fishing town of Gloucester looks out over the restless Atlantic, the water stretches to the horizon in a shifting tapestry of blues and grays. In the early 19th century, this harbor was a bustling center of New England's maritime life, its docks crowded with schooners, the air heavy with the smell of salt and drying nets. Yet in the summer of 1817, it was not the familiar rhythms of the sea that captured the townspeople's attention, but something far stranger: the repeated appearance of a creature unlike any known to science. The first sighting came in August, when a group of fishermen reported seeing a massive, undulating form just beyond the harbor. They described it as between 50 and 100 feet in length, its body dark and serpentine, moving through the water with a speed and grace that left them stunned. Most striking of all was the way it seemed to rise and fall in a series of humps, 10, perhaps 12 of them, each breaking the surface in rhythmic sequence. Word spread quickly, and within days more eyewitnesses came forward. Sailors, merchants, even town officials. The reports were remarkably consistent. Many spoke of a horse-shaped head, elevated above the water as though the creature were surveying its surroundings. Others noted a pair of small fins near the head, and skin that appeared smooth and dark, glistening in the sunlight. Some claimed the serpent moved silently, while others swore they heard a strange hissing or breathing sound. Soon, the Gloucester sea serpent, as it came to be known, was the subject of fascination throughout New England. Local authorities took the matter seriously enough to form a committee to collect and verify testimonies. Dozens of sworn statements were gathered, creating one of the most detailed historical records of a supposed sea monster. In September of that year, the Linnean Society of New England dispatched members to investigate, taking down accounts and producing sketches based on descriptions. These images depicted a long, sinuous body, somewhat like a giant snake, but with a head reminiscent of a turtle or horse. Mainstream explanations began to circulate. Some naturalists suggested the creature might have been a giant species of eel, enlarged by the imagination of startled fishermen. Others posited it could have been a school of porpoises or large fish swimming in formation, creating the illusion of a single segmented body. There was even the theory of a massive oarfish, known to grow over 30 feet long, though few had been seen in these waters, and none matched the head and movement patterns described. Yet the sightings continued into the following year, with some claiming the creature had been spotted further along the coast. Then came the twist. A smaller, younger version of the serpent was allegedly captured in the harbor and sent to Boston for study. According to the reports, it was about 3 feet long, with an elongated body and snake-like movement. The Linnaean Society examined the specimen and concluded it was a species new to science, naming it Scoliophis atlanticus. But this classification was short-lived. Later analysis determined it was nothing more than a common black snake, adapted to swimming in salt water. If the baby serpent was nothing unusual, what of the larger creature? Was the entire episode a case of mass misidentification, with excitement and rumor feeding into collective belief? Or could it have been a genuine encounter with an as-yet unidentified marine animal that simply vanished from the region? The sheer number of credible witnesses, many of them seasoned mariners accustomed to identifying sea life, makes the story difficult to dismiss outright. More speculative theories emerged in the decades that followed. Some writers suggested the Gloucester sea serpent could have been a surviving member of a prehistoric species, perhaps a plesiosaur or basilosaur, lingering in the depths of the Atlantic since the Age of Giants. Others proposed that it might have been an unusually large and ancient specimen of a known species, grown to impossible proportions. A few even hinted at the possibility of an unknown migratory creature, passing through the North Atlantic only once in a human lifetime. There were also whispers of something stranger still, that the serpent was not of this world, but a visitor from realms beyond human comprehension, an idea popular in the later 19th century, when maritime folklore often blurred the line between fact and myth. Such notions were dismissed by scientists of the time, but they persisted in popular retellings fed by the inherent mystery of the sea. By the late 1800s, sightings of the Gloucester sea serpent had dwindled, and the story gradually faded from public attention. Yet, every so often, reports of large, unidentified creatures in the waters off New England would rekindle old debates. Was it the same serpent, returning after years of absence? Or just the echo of a legend that refused to die? Today, the Gloucester sea serpent exists somewhere between history and folklore, anchored by the unusually thorough documentation of the 1817 sightings. The affidavits, sketches, and official records remain preserved, a tangible reminder that this was not merely a fireside tale, but an event that gripped an entire community. Standing on the harbor's edge now, the Atlantic stretches endlessly, its surface concealing more than it reveals. The waves roll in as they did 2 centuries ago, indifferent to the questions of those who watch from shore. Was the sea serpent a creature science has yet to name, or the product of human perception shaped by hope, fear, and wonder? The water keeps its secrets well, and perhaps, somewhere beneath the swells, the truth still moves, silent, unseen, waiting for another summer when it will rise once more to the surface. In the bustling streets of late 18th century France, amid the scent of fresh bread from corner bakeries and the calls of market vendors, there moved a man whose very existence would defy medical understanding for centuries. His name was Tarare, a thin, sallow figure with sunken eyes and a restless energy, known to locals not for his wit or his craft, but for an appetite so vast, so unrelenting, that it seemed to consume the man himself. Witnesses described him as having an unremarkable build, even underweight, yet capable of eating in a single sitting what could feed a family for days. His skin hung loosely, stretching and folding in strange ways, as though his body were built to expand beyond normal human limits. His lips were wide, his mouth able to open to an unnatural degree, revealing stained teeth and a cavernous throat. When not eating, his skin reportedly radiated heat, and his odor, an unbearable stench, clung to him as if his body itself was smoldering from the inside. The accounts began in rural France, where the young Tarare allegedly devoured entire baskets of apples, live animals, and whatever scraps he could scavenge. His hunger was insatiable. He could never feel full. As a teenager, he left home, drifting from town to town, earning coins in taverns and public squares by performing his grotesque skill, swallowing objects whole, stones, corks, even live cats and snakes, then regurgitating them, often to the horrified amusement of onlookers. By his early 20s, Tarare's unusual condition caught the attention of the French military. It was the height of the Revolutionary Wars, and France needed creative solutions for espionage. In a move that seemed almost absurd, the army employed Tarare as a courier, believing his ability to swallow and later retrieve documents could serve in smuggling intelligence past enemy lines. Encoded messages were sealed in wooden boxes, swallowed and carried within his stomach until recovery. It was a plan both daring and strange, but it faltered quickly. On one mission into Prussian territory, Tarare was captured and beaten. Though he eventually revealed his purpose under torture, the enemy, apparently too perplexed to execute him, released him. His usefulness to the military ended, but his legend had only just begun. From there, Tarare's story takes a darker turn. He entered the care of military surgeons who sought to study his condition. He was given quadruple rations, yet remained unsatisfied, often searching through refuse piles or sneaking into areas where food was stored. According to one report, he was found drinking the blood of patients undergoing bloodletting, and in another disturbing account, attempting to consume corpses in the morgue. Then came the incident that pushed his story into the realm of horror. A toddler vanished from the hospital where Tarare was being observed. Suspicion immediately fell upon him. No proof was ever found, no remains, no confession. But the accusations were enough for him to be expelled. His later years were spent wandering once more, reportedly still plagued by the hunger that had defined his life. Tarare's death came in 1798 from tuberculosis. Those who performed the autopsy were astonished. His body was found to have an abnormally large stomach, stretching from under his ribs to nearly his pelvis. His internal organs were described as misshapen, coated in ulcers, and his esophagus so wide that one could see directly into his stomach cavity. And yet, despite these anatomical oddities, no clear explanation emerged for the scale and nature of his hunger. Mainstream medical interpretations suggest possibilities such as extreme hyperthyroidism, damage to the hypothalamus, or a rare metabolic disorder that drastically increased caloric requirements. Parasitic infection, common in the 18th century, has also been proposed, though none could fully explain the breadth of his symptoms. The extreme heat, the odor, the elastic skin, and the ability to consume vast quantities of both edible and inedible material without immediate fatal consequences. From there, theories drift into the more speculative. Some have suggested Tarare's case might have been an undiscovered genetic mutation, a biological fluke so rare it has never been documented again. Others wonder if he was the victim of an as-yet unknown disease, lost to history before modern science could identify it. And, in the far reaches of conjecture, there are those who see in his condition something unnatural, a manipulation, intentional or otherwise, that left him caught between the realms of the human and the monstrous. What is perhaps most unsettling about Tarare's mystery is not merely what he ate, but the way he lived in constant torment. Contemporary accounts suggest he hated his hunger, feared it, yet was powerless to control it. It drove him to acts that alienated him from society, cost him his place in the army, and, if the whispers are true, may have pushed him into unthinkable crimes. Today, Tarare exists on the thin border between documented medical anomaly and macabre folklore. His case is recorded in historical medical journals, yet reads like something from a Gothic novel. Too strange, too disturbing, too unique to be fully accepted as ordinary pathology. Was he simply a tragic victim of a rare illness? Or was his life an encounter with a phenomenon science still cannot explain? Standing in the quiet of an 18th century French hospital ward, one might imagine the flicker of candlelight on the walls, the echo of footsteps in stone corridors, and somewhere in the shadows, a thin, pale man with sunken eyes, searching, not for company, not for purpose, but for something, anything, to eat. And perhaps the most haunting question is not what Tarare was, but whether there could be another like him, hidden somewhere in the folds of human history, waiting for their story to be told. In the fading light of a summer evening, the golden spires of the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo shimmered against the horizon, their ornate facades hiding the quiet dread that had settled within. It was here, in the waning days of Imperial Russia, that the daughters of Tsar Nicholas II, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, walked in manicured gardens, their laughter mingling with the rustle of birch leaves. Yet within just a few years, those gardens would be empty, the Romanovs' fate sealed in violence and secrecy. And from the ashes of the dynasty's fall would rise one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century, the tale of the lost Romanov princess. In July 1918, the Romanov family was executed in the cellar of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg. The official account stated that all were killed: Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and loyal attendants, before their bodies were disposed of in secret. Yet, in the years that followed, whispers spread like wildfire. One of the daughters had survived. The youngest, Grand Duchess Anastasia, became the focal point of the rumors, though some claimed it was her sister Maria. The uncertainty began with the fact that, for decades, the burial site of the Romanovs was unknown. Witnesses' testimonies from guards and Bolshevik officials were contradictory. Some claimed the bodies were burned beyond recognition. Others insisted that 1 or 2 of the children were taken away before the execution. The chaos of the Russian Civil War allowed for confusion, misinformation, and the possibility, however slim, that a princess had escaped. Then, in 1920, a woman was pulled from a Berlin canal after an apparent suicide attempt. She spoke little at first, but when she did, she claimed to be Anastasia Romanov. Her name became known to the world as Anna Anderson. Her story was detailed, at times disturbingly so, recounting moments in the Romanov household, the appearance of rooms in the palace, and the intimate personalities of family members. She claimed that during the execution she was injured but spared, spirited away by a sympathetic guard, and eventually smuggled out of Russia. For decades, Anna Anderson's claim would be fiercely debated. Supporters noted her physical resemblance to Anastasia, the uncanny knowledge she possessed, and the scars on her body that aligned with injuries reported during the execution. Detractors pointed to inconsistencies in her story, linguistic quirks suggesting a Polish upbringing, and the absence of verifiable proof. Court cases in Germany dragged on for years, yet no definitive verdict emerged. She was not the only one. Throughout Europe, numerous women stepped forward claiming to be Anastasia, or, in some cases, Maria. Some were swiftly exposed as frauds, driven by delusion, greed, or a desperate desire for identity. But the sheer number of claimants added to the mystery. Was it simply the allure of royalty in exile that drew such pretenders? Or was there truly a hidden thread of survival woven into the tragedy? By the late 20th century, advances in forensic science began to chip away at the uncertainty. In 1991, a mass grave was discovered near Yekaterinburg, containing the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters. The bodies were identified using DNA testing, matched against living relatives of the Romanovs. but the grave was incomplete. 2 children were missing. It was not until 2007 that a second, smaller grave was found nearby, holding the charred remains of a boy and a girl. DNA testing confirmed them as Alexei, the Tsarevich, and one of his sisters, either Maria or Anastasia. For many, this was the final piece of the puzzle, proof that no princess had escaped. But for others, doubts lingered. The remains were badly damaged. Could science have erred? And what of Anna Anderson? In 1994, years after her death, DNA testing on preserved tissue samples revealed no match to the Romanovs, but instead a genetic link to a Polish factory worker named Franciszka Szankowska. For skeptics, this was decisive. For believers, it was yet another mystery. Could the samples have been contaminated or even switched? Beyond the science lies something harder to measure: the emotional resonance of the story. In a century defined by revolutions, wars, and exiles, the possibility that a young princess escaped a massacre became more than a question of fact. It became a symbol of survival against impossible odds. The myth of Anastasia has been retold in books, films, and plays, shaping her into a figure suspended between history and legend. But perhaps the real question is not whether Anastasia lived, but why the idea of her survival endures. Is it the human need for hope, even in the face of overwhelming evidence? Or does the chaos of those final days in Yekaterinburg still conceal truths that no grave, no DNA test can ever fully unearth? Somewhere, in the dim corridors of the Alexander Palace or the shadows of the Ural Mountains, one might still imagine a young girl slipping through the cracks of history, her identity intact, her story untold. And if she did survive, where did she go? Who sheltered her? And why, after so many decades, has the world never found her? Off the rugged, wind-swept coast of southern Africa, the waters of the Indian Ocean stretch into a restless horizon. The swells here are powerful, unpredictable, and steeped in stories of ships that set sail, only to vanish without a trace. It was into these waters, in late July 1909, that the MV Waratah embarked on the final leg of her journey, a voyage that would end in one of maritime history's most enduring mysteries. The Waratah was no ordinary vessel. Built in Scotland in 1908 for the Blue Anchor Line, she was considered a modern marvel, part passenger liner, part cargo ship, capable of carrying both luxury travelers and vast shipments of goods. At nearly 500 feet long, with elegant cabins, plush dining areas, and the latest navigational equipment of her day, she was promoted as the Titanic of the Southern Seas, though her fate would precede that more famous disaster by 3 years. She departed Durban, South Africa, on July 26, 1909, bound for Cape Town, with 211 souls on board. For the first day or so, her voyage seemed uneventful. Passengers enjoyed the ship's comforts while crew members managed the cargo holds below. But on July 27th, as she sailed westward, the Waratah was sighted by the steamer Clan McIntyre. The two ships briefly communicated, and the Waratah was reported to be making good progress despite heavy seas. It was the last confirmed sighting. By the time she was due in Cape Town, the Waratah had disappeared entirely. No distress signals were received. No lifeboats were ever found. In the weeks that followed, an extensive search was mounted, combing the waters from Durban to Cape Town. Naval ships, merchant steamers, and even shore patrols scanned the coastlines for wreckage. Nothing surfaced. Not a plank of wood, not a piece of cargo, not a body. The complete absence of physical evidence puzzled investigators. How could such a large and well-equipped ship vanish so utterly? Mainstream theories began to take shape. One suggestion was that the Waratah encountered a sudden, massive storm, one of the infamous rogue waves known to form in the Agulhas Current, where warm waters from the north collide with cold southern currents, creating walls of water capable of swallowing ships whole. In such a scenario, the Waratah could have been overwhelmed before any distress call was sent. Another possibility was structural instability. Some crew members from earlier voyages had voiced concerns about her handling, claiming she was top-heavy when fully loaded. If she rolled sharply in rough seas, she might not have recovered, a fatal flaw that could have led to a swift capsizing. But no definitive proof of such a design weakness was ever produced, leaving this explanation in the realm of speculation. Beyond the practical theories, stranger ideas emerged. Some whispered of a freak underwater volcanic eruption along the sea floor, sending a sudden, violent surge upward to engulf the ship. Others, taking note of the complete lack of debris, speculated about the Waratah slipping into an uncharted oceanic trench, vanishing into depths unreachable by the salvage technology of the time. Over the decades, the mystery has only deepened. Numerous search expeditions, some as late as the 21st century, have scoured the seabed using sonar and submersibles. Each mission has ended in frustration. The vastness of the ocean, combined with the shifting sands and strong currents along the continental shelf, has left investigators with more questions than answers. The human side of the story adds its own layer of intrigue. Families of the passengers, left with no remains to bury, held on to hope for years that the Waratah had somehow survived, perhaps drifting to a remote island or being rescued by an uncontacted vessel. Rumors occasionally surfaced, unverified sightings of a large, unidentified steamer in distant waters, but none could be linked conclusively to the Waratah. In time, the ship's fate became a part of local lore along the South African coast. Fishermen spoke of ghostly silhouettes appearing on the horizon in bad weather, resembling the profile of the Waratah, only to vanish into mist. Some sailors even claimed to have seen her lights at night, drifting silently before fading into darkness, a spectral warning to those who dared the Agulhas current. Modern historians and oceanographers continue to study the case, mapping possible wreck sites and reconstructing her final route. Yet with no wreckage discovered, the Waratah remains more than a shipwreck story. It is a maritime enigma, defying the era's navigational records, weather data, and logical deduction. And so the question endures. Did the Waratah succumb to a sudden, violent act of nature? Or did something stranger happen in those storm-lashed waters? If she lies at the bottom of the ocean, untouched for over a century, what secrets might still rest within her steel hull? Or could she be somewhere else entirely, her story unfinished, waiting to be told by those who find her? In the quiet Hampshire countryside, nestled among rolling green fields and ancient hedgerows, stands the stately Tichborne Park Estate, a place of long lineage, inherited titles, and deep-rooted tradition. Its halls had echoed for centuries with the footsteps of one distinguished generation after another, each leaving behind portraits, documents, and the weight of family history. But in the late 19th century, this seemingly serene English estate would become the center of one of the strangest and most divisive identity controversies Britain had ever seen, a mystery that blurred the lines between fact, deception, and the fragile nature of truth itself. The story began decades earlier in the 1820s with the birth of Roger Tichborne, heir to the baronetcy. Raised partly in France, Roger was a shy, thin, and somewhat delicate young man, nothing like the imposing figure he would later be claimed to have become. In 1854, while traveling in South America, Roger disappeared after the ship he was aboard, the Belle, vanished off the coast of Brazil. All hands were presumed lost. His grieving mother, however, refused to accept his death. Clinging to the faint hope that her son had survived, she placed advertisements in newspapers across the globe offering a reward for information. Years passed. Then, in 1866, a remarkable letter arrived from Australia. A man living in Wagga Wagga, going by the name Thomas Castro, claimed to be Roger Tichborne, miraculously saved from the Bella's wreck. He alleged that after being rescued by a passing vessel, he had wandered the colonies, working as a butcher until hearing of the search for him. When he eventually traveled to England, the reaction was electric. Roger's mother, Lady Tichborne, met him and, despite his markedly different appearance, accepted him without hesitation as her long-lost son. But others in the family were deeply skeptical. The new Roger was much heavier than the slender young man who had disappeared, spoke English with an Australian accent, and seemed to have forgotten much of his aristocratic education. His manners were coarse, his knowledge of the family estate incomplete. Yet his confidence and ability to recall certain obscure details convinced some that he might, in fact, be the rightful heir. The situation spiraled into one of the longest and most sensational legal battles of the Victorian era. Supporters, known as Tichbornites, rallied around the claimant, believing they were defending a wronged man against the snobbery and prejudice of the aristocracy. Opponents painted him as an audacious impostor, attempting to defraud one of England's oldest families. The courts were flooded with conflicting testimonies. Witnesses from Australia identified him as Arthur Orton, the son of a Wapping butcher who had emigrated years earlier. They described a man with a rough, working-class background, known for tall tales and quick talk. Others swore he was indeed Roger Tichborne, citing small physical features, scars, birthmarks, that seemed to match. How could both be true? Mainstream explanations focused on mistaken identity. Memory is fragile, and after more than a decade apart, it was argued that a grieving mother might see what she desperately wished to see. The human tendency to fill in gaps, to believe in a narrative of survival, could account for Lady Tichborne's acceptance of the man before her. Yet other aspects resisted easy explanation. The claimant seemed to know intimate details about Roger's life, pet names, certain French phrases from his youth, the layout of specific rooms in the estate. That would be difficult for an outsider to learn without access to private family records. Were these facts leaked to him, or did they suggest a genuine connection? More speculative theories flourished in pamphlets, taverns, and newspapers. Some argued that the man might have been a distant relative, blending fragments of truth and fabrication to build his case. Others whispered about a hidden scandal. Perhaps the family knew he was Roger, but could not publicly acknowledge him because of disgrace or some other matter best left buried. After years of litigation, the case ended in the claimant's conviction for perjury in 1874. He was declared to be Arthur Orton and sentenced to 14 years in prison. To official history, the mystery was solved. But not everyone agreed. Many Tichbornites continued to believe in him long after his imprisonment, insisting that justice had been denied. Even decades later, some descendants of those supporters claimed the truth was never fully revealed. Modern historians, examining the case through surviving records, tend to lean toward the conclusion that the claimant was indeed Arthur Orton. Yet, the extraordinary length and complexity of the trial, the contradictions in testimony, and the enduring loyalty of some supporters hint at something more than a simple case of fraud. Did the Victorian courts suppress inconvenient evidence? Did Lady Tichborne know more than she admitted? And how did a man from the other side of the world captivate an entire nation so completely? The Tichborne claimant mystery remains as much a study of human psychology as it is a legal puzzle. At its core lies a question that resists closure. When identity is contested, and when memory, desire, and proof all pull in different directions, can we ever be entirely certain of who a person truly is? In the heart of early 19th century London, in the district of St. Giles, the air was heavy with the mingled sense of industry and the press of the poor. Cobbled streets twisted through a maze of tightly packed tenements, their windows clouded by soot, their doors opening to narrow lanes where vendors, beggars, and laborers moved shoulder to shoulder. Rising above this jumble of brick and timber stood the massive brick walls of the Horseshoe Brewery, a structure whose sheer scale spoke to the growing industrial appetite of the city. Inside, towering vats, great cylindrical hulks of iron-bound wood, held thousands of gallons of rich, dark porter, the pride of the Moo Brewery Company. It was October 17, 1814, and within one of those vast vats, holding more than 135,000 gallons of beer, a subtle but deadly weakness had begun to develop. No one noticed the signs, at least not until the iron hoops that bound the vat gave way with a metallic snap. In seconds, the enormous container ruptured, unleashing a torrent of beer so violent that it shattered another vat nearby, compounding the disaster. The combined force of the liquid, over 300,000 gallons, burst through the brewery walls, sending a churning wave into the streets of St. Giles. The flood swept through alleys and basements, smashing through doors and windows. It crashed into the crowded tenements with enough force to collapse walls, trapping residents in their own homes. The wave carried with it the stench of malt and yeast, but also the terrible reality of destruction. Furniture, debris, and bodies swept together in its path. Entire cellars filled in moments, drowning those who had no time to escape. By the time the chaos subsided, at least 8 people were dead, among them children and women who had been quietly going about their day. The official cause seemed clear enough: a structural failure, the inevitable result of time, pressure, and the constant strain on industrial equipment. The coroner's inquest declared it an act of God, absolving the brewery of legal responsibility. In an age when safety standards were minimal and public accountability scarce, the decision was not unusual. But was it the full truth? Some whispered that the vat's failure was not purely accidental. There were rumors, though unproven, that maintenance had been neglected, that the iron hoops had shown signs of wear for months prior. In a competitive brewing market, repairs might have been postponed to avoid production delays. Could negligence, hidden behind the language of divine will, have played a role? Then there were stranger accounts. Eyewitnesses who claimed to have heard the vat groaning ominously hours before the disaster, as though the wood and iron were straining under some invisible force. Others spoke of the uncanny way the flood seemed to choose its path, sweeping hardest into certain streets and houses while sparing others with inexplicable precision. Local superstition soon wrapped itself around the event. St. Giles had long been known for its poverty, crime, and disease, conditions that made it a place many in London's higher classes preferred to forget. For some, the flood became a kind of grim moral tale, a punishment visited on a district perceived as unruly and godless. Others, particularly among the poor themselves, saw it differently. A cruel act of fate that struck without warning, made all the more bitter because it came not from fire or storm, but from something as mundane and human-made as beer. Theories flourished in the taverns and newspapers. Some suggested sabotage, perhaps by a rival brewery eager to tarnish the Meuse name. The idea seemed far-fetched, yet the sheer force required to rupture such a vat made some wonder if it could have happened without deliberate interference. There were even claims that the vats themselves were cursed, tied to older brewery buildings that had once stood on the site. Folklore held that certain plots of London ground were ill-fated, and that no good could come from the industry built upon them. From a modern perspective, the physics of the event are easy enough to explain. The pressure inside the vat was immense, and the sudden failure of one hoop created a chain reaction, unleashing catastrophic energy. Yet, even with this understanding, questions remain about the circumstances that led to such a failure. Why was there no redundancy in the containment systems? How could a single point of weakness cause such an immense disaster? And then there is the matter of the disaster's strange afterlife in public memory. In the years that followed, the Great Beer Flood became something of a grim curiosity, retold in tones that blended tragedy with a macabre humor. Some reports fixated on the spectacle rather than the loss of life, reducing the event to a bizarre footnote in London's history. Others recorded more haunting details: the smell of beer lingering for days, the stains on the walls of cellars that could not be scrubbed away, and the eerie quiet that settled over St. Giles once the waters had drained. Did this shift in tone, from horror to oddity, serve to obscure the deeper truth? Was it easier for the public to laugh at the absurdity of a beer flood than to confront the negligence or structural vulnerabilities it may have revealed? And might that laughter have been encouraged by those with something to hide? Today, the site of the Horseshoe Brewery is long gone, replaced by modern buildings. Yet beneath the pavement, the ground once soaked in thousands of gallons of porter still holds its history. Records and archives preserve the official account, but the unanswered questions persist, tucked between the lines of testimony and the gaps in surviving evidence. Was it merely an industrial accident, a tragic convergence of physics and poor luck? Or did unseen hands, or unseen forces, help set the disaster in motion? Over 2 centuries later, the Great Beer Flood of London remains an event that refuses to settle neatly into the past, leaving us to wonder whether, beneath its surface, lies a truth still waiting to be uncovered. It is a grainy black and white photograph, the sort you might find in the back pages of a forgotten newspaper or tucked into a dusty archive box. The scene seems ordinary at first glance. A public square in the mid-20th century, men in suits and fedoras, women in dresses and gloves, the background blurred with the outlines of cars and buildings from another age. But at the edge of the frame, there is a woman whose presence draws the eye. She is wrapped in a headscarf, the kind worn for modesty or warmth, tied neatly under her chin. She appears to be holding something to her face, perhaps a camera, her stance rigid, her gaze fixed on something outside the shot. It is an image that feels strangely familiar, echoing a figure made famous years later in 1963 in the aftermath of President John F. Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, the so-called Babushka Lady, the mysterious woman who filmed the events from an angle no one else seemed to have. But this photograph predates that tragedy, its exact date uncertain, possibly from the 1930s or 1940s. And in this earlier case, the woman is again present at the scene of an event of great historical significance, yet one that should have been captured in detail, but for which crucial evidence has gone missing. Historians have traced several such appearances of scarf-wrapped women in critical moments before 1950. In each, the woman, or perhaps different women with an eerily similar look, stands slightly apart from the crowd, camera in hand, her identity unknown, her purpose unclear. One such sighting was allegedly recorded in photographs from the 1937 Hindenburg disaster in New Jersey. Another was linked to blurred footage from the 1939 New York World's Fair, where a headscarfed woman appears in the background just minutes before a small but suspicious explosion rocked the British pavilion. In each case, official investigations make no mention of her, and no one ever comes forward to say they knew who she was. Could this be mere coincidence? Skeptics argue that the headscarf was a common fashion choice, worn by countless women across decades and continents. The fact that a few were photographed with cameras at major public events could simply reflect the growing popularity of portable photography in the early 20th century. Yet others note something unsettling. In each documented case, her position in the crowd is uncannily strategic, close enough to capture key details, yet just far enough to avoid being part of the central action. The possibility of an intelligence connection inevitably surfaces. The years before and during the Second World War were rife with espionage. Women were frequently employed as couriers, informants, and undercover operatives precisely because they could blend more easily into public settings. Could the so-called early babushka have been a spy, photographing targets, testing camera equipment, or recording crowd movements for agencies we now know only through declassified fragments? If so, who did she work for? British intelligence? The Soviets? The Americans? Or perhaps a private network of agents whose affiliations are still obscured by time? More speculative minds take the mystery further. The striking resemblance between the woman in these early images and the later babushka lady of 1963 has fueled theories of deliberate continuity, or even something far stranger. Could they be the same person, operating decades apart, somehow unchanged in age? A trick of perception, perhaps, or the human mind's tendency to see patterns where none exist. And yet, the idea has led some to fold the mystery into the realm of alleged time travel experiments, secret government projects, and fringe accounts of individuals appearing at key moments in history to record or observe. The visual evidence, while compelling, is maddeningly incomplete. Photographs are cropped, blurred, or too distant to provide detail. The supposed film reels attributed to her have never surfaced, or, if they once existed, may have been confiscated or destroyed. In some cases, witnesses described seeing a woman with a scarf taking photographs, only for those images never to appear in the public record. The parallel to the later Dallas incident is difficult to ignore, but perhaps the most haunting aspect is not her appearance, but her disappearance. In every instance, after the moment is captured, she vanishes from the scene with no trace, no police interviews, no media follow-ups, no personal testimonies. If she was indeed a bystander, why leave no footprint in the historical record? And if she was something more, then how extensive must her resources or her protection have been to remain invisible for so long? There is also the question of motive. If these were merely personal photographs, where are they now? In an attic box in a family home? Locked in a government archive stamped with classification codes? Or were they sent somewhere else entirely, perhaps never intended for public eyes? Some researchers have attempted to reconstruct her possible route through history. They point to a woman matching her description in a 1945 photograph taken in Berlin, just days before the city fell to Allied forces. In the image, she appears again at a distance, camera poised amid the rubble and chaos. Others claim she can be found in rare footage from a 1948 political rally in Eastern Europe, again on the periphery, again watching. The thread is thin, fragile, and easily dismissed. Yet it persists, drawing in those who see in these coincidences the outline of a story that has never been told, a story of someone who, for reasons unknown, moved from one historic moment to another, silently documenting, always present yet never acknowledged. Was she a professional photographer with an uncanny instinct for being in the right or wrong place at the right time? A government operative whose photographs shaped intelligence decisions we will never know about. A coincidence magnified by our fascination with patterns and mysteries, or something altogether beyond our present understanding. The photographs remain. They do not speak, but they linger, mute, grainy witnesses to events that shaped the modern world. And within them, the scarfed woman remains fixed in her posture, camera in hand, forever on the threshold of revelation. Her face, partially obscured, seems to look past the viewer, into some point in time we cannot follow. And it leaves us to wonder, was she merely another anonymous figure lost to history, or was she part of a hidden design, one whose threads still weave unseen through the events of our past? It is a fog-laden morning in a European capital during the uneasy calm of the late 1930s. The air is cool, heavy with the scent of coal smoke and damp stone. the streets alive with the quiet shuffle of pedestrians making their way to work. Market vendors set up their stalls, their voices muted by the mist. Somewhere in the blur of silhouettes and gaslight, a lone figure stands still, her head wrapped in a simple scarf tied neatly under her chin, her coat buttoned to the neck. In her hands, she holds what appears to be a compact camera, the sort that was beginning to appear in the hands of journalists and hobbyists alike. She is not speaking to anyone. She is not shopping. She is watching. To most passers-by, she would have been just another ordinary woman, unremarkable in a city of thousands. But for those who later examined the surviving photographs of that day, her presence became more than an incidental detail. The images, taken just before a small but politically significant public disturbance, show her standing at an angle to the crowd, as if ensuring the best vantage point. Her expression is unreadable, her gaze intent. What makes this so unusual is not merely the image itself, but the fact that she appears in similar photographs from other cities and other years. Berlin in 1936, Prague in 1938, even as far as London in the early months of 1939. In each, the headscarfed woman is placed with uncanny precision on the periphery, yet facing the heart of unfolding events. Researchers who have tried to trace her identity have run into a frustrating wall. No records of her name exist in police or press archives. Witnesses recall seeing a woman with a scarf and a camera, but none could say who she was or where she went afterward. Some insisted they saw her vanish into the crowd minutes before officials moved in, her presence never officially acknowledged. Mainstream historians often attribute the mystery to coincidence. The late 1930s were years of upheaval, and the portable camera was becoming an increasingly accessible tool. Women across Europe wore scarves against the cold, and modesty was still a social norm in many places. A figure matching this description could easily have been photographed multiple times without being the same individual, and yet certain details refuse to fade into coincidence. In every documented case, she seems to choose her position with deliberate intent, aligned with entrances, exits, or the exact trajectory of a key political figure. Her camera, if indeed it was a camera, is never seen from the front. The images always catch her mid-gesture, hands raised, as though she is either filming or photographing. None of her alleged photographs have ever surfaced. This has led to theories of intelligence work. The late 1930s were a golden era for espionage, with networks of spies and informants operating under the cover of ordinary civilian life. Could she have been an operative for an agency preparing for the war everyone sensed was coming? The Soviet NKVD, the British SIS, the German Abwehr, all were active, and all employed women in covert roles. The anonymity of a scarf-wrapped civilian would have been ideal cover for close-range surveillance. More speculative voices suggest something even stranger. The repeated resemblance of this woman to later, better-documented babushka figures, most famously in Dallas, 1963, has encouraged theories of a continuous, decades-spanning presence. How could the same face, the same posture, the same choice of attire appear across such widely separated moments in history? Was it simply the persistence of a common look? Or is there a thread running through these appearances that has yet to be uncovered? The photographs themselves raise further questions. Some are clear enough to confirm that the woman, if the same in all instances, would have aged very little over the span of several years. Others are grainy, leaving her features open to interpretation. Critics argue this is a classic example of pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns, even identities, in unrelated images. But the placement, the timing, the vanishing act after each event, it keeps the mystery alive. Her disappearance, when it came, was as silent as her appearances had been. After the outbreak of World War II, No photographs or reports of her have surfaced, at least none that have been publicly acknowledged. If she had been an operative, perhaps she was recalled, reassigned, or eliminated. If she had been a civilian, perhaps she simply changed her appearance, abandoned the camera, and returned to anonymity. But if she was part of something more extraordinary, her absence might not signify an ending at all, only a shift to places and times we have yet to examine. One final fragment adds to the intrigue. A handwritten note found in the belongings of a deceased photojournalist in the 1970s. It contained a list of locations and dates, many corresponding to known sightings of the scarfed woman. Beside the last entry, Warsaw, August 1939, were 2 words: she knew. The note was unsigned. The journalist had never published any work mentioning her. What did she know? Who was she? Was she documenting history, shaping it, or merely observing from the shadows for reasons we can only guess at? The foggy streets of pre-war Europe have long since cleared, and the photographs have yellowed with age. Yet the image of the Lady Babushka endures. Silent, unclaimed, inexplicably present at moments of great consequence, and gone before anyone thought to ask her name. And perhaps that is why her story still lingers. Because somewhere, in the blur of our collective memory, there remains the sense that her gaze was not upon the events unfolding before her, but upon something else entirely, something beyond our reach. Far out in the warm, turquoise waters of the Gulf of Mexico, sunlight shimmers over the gentle swell of the sea. Here, somewhere between the Yucatan Peninsula and the open ocean, there was once said to be a small, rocky island, Bermeja. Its name first appeared in 16th-century Spanish maritime charts, marked as a modest outcrop with reddish tones, perhaps from the hue of its rocks or the algae that clung to its shores. Sailors of the era described it as a barren but useful landmark, a fixed point in an otherwise vast and uniform expanse of water. The earliest known mention comes from maps commissioned by the Spanish crown, where Bermeja is placed in clear, deliberate strokes, its position seemingly as certain as any other feature of the Gulf. Over the next 3 centuries, the island continued to appear in nautical charts, mentioned in logs, and copied from one mapmaker's hand to another. It was never depicted as large, just a speck, but a real one, a place navigators could rely on. And then, sometime in the 19th century, Bermeja began to slip from view. Reports of it became less frequent. By the late 20th century, when modern hydrographic surveys scoured the Gulf, the island was nowhere to be found. Its coordinates led only to open sea. No shallow reef, no submerged volcanic rise, just depths of blue water that gave no hint an island had ever been there. This absence prompted the first question: had Bermeja ever existed at all? One school of thought points to cartographic error. In the age before precise instruments, maps were often compiled from second-hand reports and rough bearings taken at sea. A rock formation glimpsed in poor weather, or even a mirage on the horizon, could be logged as real and perpetuated for centuries through repetition. Could Bermeja have been nothing more than a mistake copied from map to map until it became real on paper? Yet this explanation has its weaknesses. Some accounts describe sailors actually setting foot on the island, using it as a landmark or a reference point during long voyages. A handful of early descriptions even note its red-tinged stone, details that feel oddly specific for a mere phantom. Another possibility is that Bermeja did exist but was erased by natural forces. Islands can and do vanish, washed away by hurricanes, swallowed by rising seas, or subsiding into the ocean due to geological instability. The Gulf of Mexico is not without its storms, and over centuries, erosion could have reduced a small rocky isle to nothing. But would such a process leave no trace, no shoals, no underwater plateau? When Mexican researchers conducted sonar scans of the supposed location in the late 1990s, They found nothing to suggest even a drowned island. It is here that the mystery begins to edge into more speculative territory. Some theories suggest human intervention. Bermeja's coordinates once lay within an area of significant economic interest. Waters rich in fish, oil, and natural gas. Could the island have been deliberately removed from official records to alter territorial claims? Modern maritime boundaries in the Gulf are complex, shaped by treaties and exclusive economic zones. If an island marked on centuries of maps were proven to exist, it could shift the lines dramatically, granting one nation access to valuable resources. The idea is provocative, a centuries-old speck of land influencing 20th century geopolitics. There are darker conjectures still. A few researchers have whispered about the possibility that Bermeja was destroyed, its rock blasted apart and sunk, though such an act would require extraordinary effort and motive. No evidence has been found to support this, yet the notion lingers, in part because of a curious coincidence. Just as interest in the island resurfaced in the late 1990s and surveys sought to confirm its existence, it was declared gone forever. The emotional pull of the mystery lies not only in Bermeja's disappearance, but in its stubborn trace on history. Old maps, preserved in archives in Spain and Mexico, still show it clearly marked, a silent challenge to the empty ocean where it should be. The ink insists on its reality. The sea does not. Some island disappearances can be solved with geology, with tides and storms, with human forgetfulness. But Bermeja's vanishing remains oddly resistant to such closure. If it was a cartographer's mistake, why did the error persist for so long without correction? If it was real, why has the ocean erased it so completely? And if forces, natural or human, conspired to remove it, what was at stake that warranted its erasure? Today, ships pass over its supposed location without knowing they are crossing the coordinates of an enigma. Fishermen cast their nets into waters once charted as solid ground, and in quiet corners of maritime history, Bermeja's name survives, an island that may never have existed, or one that was lost for reasons we are not meant to uncover. Perhaps the truth is still out there, waiting in some overlooked logbook, in the account of a long-dead sailor, or in the archives of powers who once found it useful to forget. Until then, Bermeja exists only in the tension between map and memory, a place that might have been and might yet be, if only we knew where to look. On a bitterly cold January afternoon in 1919, the streets of Boston's North End were alive with the sharp metallic scent of winter air. Cobbled lanes wound between brick buildings, their walls worn smooth by decades of salt-laden breezes off the harbor. Looming over this tightly knit neighborhood stood a hulking cylindrical structure, a massive steel storage tank, 50 feet high and nearly as wide, filled to the brim with more than 2 million gallons of thick, dark molasses. The tank was owned by the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, and in the winter light it appeared almost black, an ominous silhouette against the pale sky. It was just after noon on January 15th when a low, resonant groan echoed across the district, a sound so alien that some would later describe it as the roar of artillery. Without warning, the tank's riveted steel plates gave way. A towering wall of molasses, moving at an estimated 35 miles per hour, surged into the streets. Witnesses recalled the sight in stunned disbelief. A dark, glistening wave, 25 feet high in places, obliterating everything in its path. Wooden carts splintered like twigs, horses were swept away, and buildings crumpled under the weight of the onrushing syrup. The disaster claimed 21 lives and injured more than 150. Those who survived spoke of being trapped in the sticky tide, struggling to breathe as the heavy liquid clung to their skin and pulled them down. Even days later, the stench lingered in the air, and Boston's harbor reportedly bore a brownish hue for months afterward. Yet, while the destruction was clear, the cause was far from straightforward. The official explanation pointed to engineering failure. Investigations revealed that the tank had been poorly constructed, its steel walls too thin for the immense pressure they held, its seams leaking for years. Residents had complained of molasses oozing from the joints, but the company brushed off the warnings. In the bitter cold of January, some theorized that a sudden, unseasonable warm spell caused the fermenting molasses to expand, placing unbearable strain on the already compromised structure. But here, the story begins to branch into stranger territory. The molasses had been delivered only days before, shipped from warmer climates where it had been stored in heat. When combined with older fermenting stock inside the tank, the mix could have generated not just heat, but gas, carbon dioxide building silently until the pressure reached a catastrophic tipping point. Could the Great Molasses Flood have been, in part, a chemical explosion? Some have speculated further. The year was 1919, and prohibition was on the verge of becoming law. Industrial alcohol, distilled from molasses, was in high demand, not just for legal use, but for the illicit market that was already stirring. The company faced intense scrutiny, both from government regulators and criminal enterprises. Was the disaster truly an accident, or could it have been sabotage, an act of vengeance, or a calculated move to destroy evidence of improper dealings? This theory, while fringe, is not entirely without precedent. The early 20th century saw numerous acts of industrial sabotage, often tied to labor unrest or political extremism. In the years just prior, anarchist bombings had targeted factories, politicians, and financiers. Some residents whispered that the tank's destruction was no mechanical failure at all, but a deliberate attack masked as misfortune. Yet no conclusive proof ever emerged. Then there is the curious matter of how the molasses moved. Eyewitnesses spoke of its uncanny force, likening it to a living thing, its speed and power exceeding what many thought possible for such a dense liquid in cold weather. Engineers have since debated whether the wave's lethality was due solely to gravity and volume, or if there was some additional catalyst, a sudden release of gas or energy that propelled it forward faster than physics seemed to allow. In the aftermath, crews worked for weeks to clean the neighborhood, scrubbing streets, walls, and even the undersides of elevated train tracks. The molasses seemed to defy removal, its sugary residue clinging stubbornly to every surface it touched. Long after the last trace was gone, residents claimed they could still catch the faint, sweet smell on hot summer days, as though the disaster had etched itself into the very stones of the North End. The official inquiry placed the blame squarely on corporate negligence, leading to one of the first significant legal rulings to hold a company liable for such widespread destruction. Yet the lingering oddities, the suddenness of the rupture, the extraordinary momentum of the wave, and the possibility of hidden motives have left some questioning whether the full story has ever been told. Why did the tank fail that day and not in the years prior, despite visible signs of strain? Was it truly just the perfect storm of temperature, pressure, and faulty engineering? Or was there another hand at work, unseen in the official records, but quietly shaping the tragedy? More than a century later, the Great Molasses Flood remains a fixture in Boston's collective memory. A surreal, almost absurd event that, upon closer examination, holds as much darkness as it does strangeness. And somewhere beneath the weight of accepted history, there may still lie details that could shift our understanding entirely, if only they were brought to light. The Amazon rainforest, vast and impenetrable, stretches for thousands of miles in every direction, a living ocean of green that swallows light, sound, and certainty. In its depths, rivers wind like serpents beneath the thick canopy, their dark waters reflecting the heavy sky. Here, the air hangs dense and warm, carrying the scent of damp earth and unseen life. It was into this mysterious realm in 1925 that Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett ventured, never to return. Fawcett was not merely an explorer. He was a figure of almost mythical determination. A decorated British officer and accomplished cartographer, he had mapped vast swaths of South America for the Royal Geographical Society. Yet, what drew him back to the Amazon time and again was not just the allure of untamed land, it was a vision. He believed in the existence of a lost city, which he called simply Z, a place of monumental stone architecture hidden deep within the jungle. Influenced by fragments of indigenous lore, cryptic archaeological finds, and his own encounters in the field, Fawcett was convinced that this city predated European contact and might even rival the great civilizations of the ancient world. In April of 1925, accompanied by his 21-year-old son, Jack, and Jack's close friend, Raleigh Rimmel, Fawcett set out from the Brazilian frontier town of Cuiabá. They carried few supplies, preferring to travel light, and they had orders to avoid large parties to reduce the risk of hostilities with indigenous tribes. For weeks, occasional letters made their way back, reporting progress and describing the oppressive beauty of the jungle. Then, after May 29th, the stream of messages ceased. The last report placed them near the upper reaches of the Xingu River, a place from which no confirmed word would ever emerge. The disappearance sparked an international sensation. Rescue missions, some sanctioned and others purely speculative, were launched in the years that followed. Few returned with clear answers. Some searchers vanished themselves. Others came back with stories of hostility from indigenous groups, illness, or the sheer impossibility of penetrating the terrain. There were claims of sightings. A man resembling Fawcett living among a remote tribe, his son held captive, or even skeletal remains thought to be theirs. Yet none of these accounts ever stood up to rigorous verification. The simplest theory is also the bleakest, that the party was killed, either by disease, starvation, or attack. The Xingu region was home to several groups that viewed outsiders with deep suspicion, having suffered from previous contact. But the indigenous people's own oral histories offer another, more complex thread. Some elders, interviewed decades later, claimed that the men had reached a particular village, been treated with caution, and then, after a dispute, met their end. The details of that dispute, however, remain shrouded in secrecy. Then there are the more tantalizing possibilities. Could Fawcett have actually found something? An isolated community, ruins of an ancient city, and chosen to remain? Some suggest that his decision to bring his son may have been more than familial. It may have been a deliberate step toward establishing a new life far from the modern world. The idea is seductive, but without proof. It remains speculation. Other theories drift into the extraordinary. Stories emerged of strange stone structures hidden in the jungle, of artifacts inconsistent with known Amazonian cultures, and even of tribes who spoke of ancestors from a city of light. These fragments fueled decades of conjecture about a sophisticated pre-Columbian civilization lost to time. Modern archaeological work has, in recent years, uncovered large, geometrically patterned earthworks in parts of the Amazon, suggesting the forest was once home to complex societies. Could Fawcett have stumbled upon early evidence of this, only to vanish before the world could know? Equally perplexing is the fact that Fawcett was no amateur. He understood the perils of the Amazon better than most, its diseases, predators, and shifting river channels. He carried with him not just navigational skill, but a deep respect for the land and its people. For such a man to disappear without a trace seems almost inconceivable. In the absence of hard evidence, the story has become a mirror for our own fascinations. For some, it is a cautionary tale of human overreach. of a man whose romantic vision led him into a place where nature allows no mistakes. For others, it is a heroic saga of pursuit, a testament to the enduring pull of the unknown. And for a few, it remains a living mystery, one that suggests that somewhere in the tangled green heart of the Amazon, secrets survive untouched, guarded by the forest itself. Nearly a century later, the jungle has reclaimed whatever clues might have remained, if indeed they were ever there to find. The rivers still run, the canopy still whispers, and the path Fawcett took is as inscrutable now as it was on that final day of contact. Did he perish within weeks of his last letter, his bones scattered and unmarked beneath the leaf litter? Did he find Z and choose silence over return? Or could the truth be stranger still, hidden beneath centuries of overgrowth, waiting for the moment when the forest decides to yield it?